cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 31. The kind yet heartless man. Was it because the coin missed? That was the very first thing she thought of at the news about Duke Herhardt's homecoming. The Duke, who had announced the postponement of his service in the military post by another year, would return home and reside at the Arvis estate for good after settling all of his business affairs in the capital. The Grand Duchess wished for her grandson to stay close by her side and take care of the 20,000-hectare estate they owned. The Duke seemed to take it into account as he couldn't rule out his grandmother's request. Oh, whatever. Leyla stretched her apron and laced it tightly around her waist. The matter had nothing to do with her, though. She merely lamented that her bouncing gold coin had hindered her wish from coming true. Please don't let me run into Duke Herhardt again, Leyla fervently prayed as she threw the last gold coin he had given her onto the fountain. Since last summer, after he left Arvis estate, Matthias hadn't returned for a single-day visit till the end of the year. Leyla thought her prayer had been granted by all means. The peaceful days of her life would last until his military service was over, and she would have already left Arvis by the time he returned home. Leyla fell into a daze for a moment, but soon, she shook her head and walked out towards the backyard. Besides, her wish would likely come true since she would have already left the Arvis forest by the time the Duke arrived back from his trip. With a lighter heart, Leyla started caring for the livestock and tended to the garden diligently. The moment her morning routine was winding down, Phoebe, the mountain pigeon, returned from the Edmonds' house, bringing a letter from Kyle that was attached to its ankle. My mom wants to invite you to dinner tonight. See, Leyla. I was right, huh? She could hear Kyle's voice in the letter. After seeing her anxiety, Kyle had reassured her a million times that his mother would like her and that she would be accepted in his family. Everything will be fine. He soothed her. When the autumn dawned, they would become a campus couple and enjoy their college years together happily, very happily. Uncle, I'll have dinner at Edmund's house tonight. Leyla approached Uncle Bill, who had just gotten home from work. Mrs. Edmund invited me. Look, what did I say before? Said Bill in a raspy voice, reiterating the same thing Kyle had said in the letter. Didn't I tell you that everything would be all right? Looking upon his gleeful face, Leyla also gave a soft smile of her own. Her heart was pounding. She put her faith in his words and was looking forward for tonight's dinner. The evening sun had cast long shadows on the ground when Matthias arrived in Arvis Manor. The tension didn't escape the faces of the waiting staff in line when the car transporting him appeared in front of the lobby. Everything was in the groove. He was welcomed with loving arms with courtesies and was given some joyful smiles from the two duchesses, who were standing next to him. Every time he passed in front of the gardener, Matthias tended to lower his gaze. A little girl in neat brown shoes always stood in line next to the gardener's big feet, ready to greet him whenever he came home. But Leyla Lewellin, who had always been by Bill Remmer's side, would no longer be here after the summer season ended. Matthias walked past the gardener without even bothering to look at him. His sight turned back towards the front entrance, where he could see the stairwell in the lobby leading to the manor's main hall. Oh my, that bird also returned with you. Leyla von Herhardt chuckled the moment she gazed upon the gilded cage that a servant was holding. Inside the cage, there was a little canary that Matthias had brought with him when he departed the estate last summer. What a very strange thing. How could Matthias, who has never even had a pet dog, take care of a bird? If you have a hobby with birds, why don't you expand the greenhouse a bit more and bring in different kinds of birds? Suggested Norma with a smile on her face. It's fine, Grandma. Matthias grinned as he said. One is enough. After giving a prudent answer, Matthias entered the mansion. Before going up the stairwell, Matthias reared his head and gazed at the huge chandelier for a long, thoughtful moment. Right above it, the insignia of the Herhardt family was emblazoned on its distantly high ceiling. He was born under that crest. He lived beneath that crest, and he would close his eyes under that crest. It was a natural cycle, just as breathing in, just as easy as he was living. Matthias lowered his gaze and started ascending a flight of steps. If he had retired this year, why would he still want to put it off another year? Countess Brandt grumbled beneath her breath. Her voice was laced with annoyance that she couldn't keep hidden. The reason she had agreed in the first place to extend her daughter's engagement period for another year was solely out of respect for Duke Herhardt's choice to serve the Empire. Nonetheless, if she had known what was going to happen, she would have insisted on having the wedding by the end of this summer, no matter what. I had no idea Matthias was such a fickle guy. Our wedding has been postponed, Claudine passively said, but I think it would be better if Duke Herhardt returned to the estate earlier, Mother. Nothing on her face indicated that she was upset. You seem so relaxed. This mother of yours is very worried to see her daughter unable to marry this year. Is there any reason to be concerned? It is better to take the time to properly prepare rather than have a wedding that is less than perfect due to hastiness. 1 year is a long period of time, Claudine. How do you know what might happen within a year? Think about last year, Mother. A year passed in a flash, and peacefully. We just have to wait 1 more year. Wedding preparations will also be easier if Duke Herhardt stays on the estate. Claudine, men are to be trusted, and engagement isn't a binding commitment like marriage. He's Matthias von Herhardt, Mother. With a nonchalant face, Claudine added, he is Duke Herhardt, a man who will never love anyone but himself. Claudine might as well have been feeling uneasy about her wedding if she hadn't heard the news that Leyla and the doctor's son were getting married. But now that Leyla Lewellin was a fly in the ointment no longer, her mother's worries were nothing more than the elderly's fuddy-duddy fears. For him, this engagement is also a symbol of pride for the Herhardts. There's no one who can get in the way. Claudine spoke her thoughts with confidence as she cut and neatened the embroidery thread. The kind yet heartless man. Since childhood, that's how Matthias was nicknamed. While her other cousins often made fun of Claudine with their snarky jokes, only Matthias remained polite and kind to her. Whereas, his good Samaritan attitude also built a barrier between them and made him a difficult man to attract. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Does he even have feelings? Claudine sometimes wondered about it. It was difficult for her to envision Matthias being angry, sad, or happy. From the beginning of his life to this day, he seemed to look down on the world with his arrogant yet elegant smile. And this Matthias von Herhardt was something Claudine wanted to own. I should visit Arvis sometime next week. Claudine rose from the sofa, her mood became a bit lighter. I want to meet Duke Herhardt and congratulate my friend who is getting married soon. It's for both of these reasons. A friend who's getting married? Oh my goodness. By friend did you mean the gardener's orphan? Countess Brandt gave a fretful moo. Claudine smiled without a hitch to her mother and said, Leyla is my friend. Of course, I have to give my old friend a wedding present. Leyla wrapped herself in a white dress she had bought in Rats after so much consideration when she traveled there to take the exam. Her golden hair was nicely braided, and she adorned the end of her hair with her favorite ribbon. This was not her first visit to the Edmund household, but Leyla felt uneasy for some reason. Her insides felt queasy as if this was her first. The thought of her upcoming marriage to Kyle exacerbated her nerves, and the fact that the person who personally invited her was Kyle's mother further added to her concerns. Uncle, how do I look? Leyla walked out of her room. She stood in front of Bill and asked with a solemn expression. Bill, who was mellowing out by the opened window with his mouth smoking his cigarette, looked at Leyla and grinned widely. Whoa. Since you're going to get married soon, it seems you're going all out and dressing up unlike before. It's not like that, I'm just really nervous about meeting Mrs. Edmund. Goodness me. Haven't you already met Mrs. Edmund once or twice before? But today is a special event. There's nothing to worry about. It won't be a problem. Bill gave a gentle smile as he stubbed out his cigarette and got up from his seat. You just have to be yourself, Leyla. That's enough. Bill gently patted Layla's shoulder. His smiling face felt warm, so did his hand. Leyla smiled. She willingly nodded, even though she knew it was simply his subjective point of view. After a whole day of fretting, she was finally able to relax a little bit. Kyle arrived in the cottage at that moment. Kyle, perfect. Kyle lauded her before Leyla could raise a question. Just be yourself. He cracked a smile. His gaze was warm, identical to Uncle Bill's. That's all you need, Leyla, Kyle reassured her. Well, someone else had said precisely the same thing as you did. Leyla giggled as she witnessed two people with the same expression and said say very similar the exact same things. What? Who? What kind of person? Don't talk crap and get going, you little prick. Bill smacked Kyle on the back with all his might. Kyle staggered back and turned around, his face scrunched up. But, Uncle, some jerk is hitting on her. That jerk is me. So? What? You spoiled gluttonous brat, you. I'll seriously consider whether or not I can entrust Leyla to you. Contrary to his scathing tone, Bill Remmer kindly patted Kyle on the shoulder. Leyla stood aside and quietly watched the pair's bickering. Her two most beloved people in the world. Her two precious people. Two people she wanted to protect by all means. Her heart began to warm, a smile blossomed on her face. Uncle Bill and Kyle were her everything, and Leyla couldn't fathom living her life without those two by her side. That's why Leyla decided to get married after a long shilly-shallying. As Kyle proposed to her and she turned him down, the strain in their relationship grew bigger. If she couldn't accept his feelings, it would be right for her to walk away. Kyle tried hard to narrow the distance between them, but since he had already revealed his feelings, they were faced with two choices: get married or become strangers. It would crush her innermost hope for them to stick as dear friends forever if they grew up by keeping their distance from one another. Leyla could feel her heart breaking every time she thought of them, from the fall through the winter, and into the spring living as strangers. For Leyla, the marriage and the future that Kyle had proffered to her, was a vague picture in the distance. She was cowed into indulging her avarice to a line that was beyond her reach. But if it was the only way for her not to lose Kyle, Leyla wanted to be brave. It was late spring, after Herhardt had insulted her until she cried her eyes out. Leyla finally made up her mind. On that night, she dumped his gold coins into a fountain because she didn't desire anything he had given to her. Then she saw Kyle's face, who had come searching for her soon after that. The moment she met Kyle, all of the sadness and grief in her heart were wholly forgotten. He stood up like a beacon of light amidst a dark forest. Like the warm light from Uncle Bill's cottage, which always awaited her return, and belighted her voyage through the dark forest trail. That glint of light became her solace and comforted all of her wounds that the world beyond the forest had given to her. Wontedly, Kyle and Bill's futile argument ended with a jolly laugh. With the lingering peel of a smile still hardened on his face, Kyle walked up to her. "Let's go, Leyla." Kyle reached out his hand to her. With some reluctance, Leyla grabbed the tip of his. Kyle held his gaze at her for a long moment. He grinned and then gently took her hand. So intimate and in such a tight hold. Though the changing of their relationship was still very awkward and embarrassing, Leyla didn't brush off his hand. Because he was Kyle, the person she didn't want to lose. Cry. Even better if you beg. Chapter 32. Happy Days. Mrs. Ettman welcomed her guests with a table loaded with delectable dishes and lavishly garnished with exquisite decorations. Leyla, as well as Dr. Ettman and Kyle, were dazed by the warm hospitality presented by the lady of the house, which was something above their expectation. "Thank you for the invitation, Mrs. Ettman." Leyla delivered a greeting which she had rehearsed dozens of times during the day and politely handed over the gift she had prepared, a bouquet of roses and pickled peaches parceled nicely in a beautiful mason jar. "Thank you." Mrs. Ettman gladly accepted the gift. As a heave of sigh washed over her, Layla's face lit up and Kyle's lips twitched like a grin. Mrs. Ettman's eyes grew icily cold as she watched her son, yet she deftly set her expression like a mother who was full of tenderness. Dr. Ettman alluded that they'd tie the knot after the college's enrollment announcement was released. However, since Kyle and Leyla were both unquestionably accepted, it could be said that their marriage had been officially confirmed. "My son is together with such a girl." Mrs. Ettman slowly clenched her hand beneath the table. She was disenchanted, yet she had stalled voicing her disapproval. She clearly knew what kind of people her son and husband were. Her intransigent opposition had only served to backfire back on her in the end. "Eat a lot, Leyla." Mrs. Ettman's expression softened after taking a deep breath. I specially prepared the food to your taste." She looked at Leyla with a more pleasant countenance. Leyla blinked her eyes in surprise and smiled back at Mrs. Edman, though she felt strange slits of fury flickered on her beautiful face. "Bitch, you must have seduced my son with that face and smile." Mrs. Edman quickly snatched a glass of water from the table. She could feel the slightest drip of ice-cold water drain down her esophagus. "Thank you very much, ma'am." Dimples appeared on Layla's cheeks as she said, expressing her heartfelt gratitude. Leyla was a good girl, a really nice girl. Mrs. Edman acknowledged that fact. And it was for that reason, above all others, why she never wanted Leyla to become her daughter-in-law. It's probably a lot better if she was a troublesome child. That way, she could loathe her for the proper reason instead of hating her because she was poor. At the very least, she wouldn't be ashamed of herself for being such a terrible mother. But now, she hated everything about Leyla Lewellin. She detested all of her kindness, her brilliance, and her impoverishment. "Leyla, do you know? Dr. Lawrence, a professor at Rats University, is an avian biologist." Dr. Edman abruptly changed the topic after witnessing his wife's unpleasant expression. "Once you enter, be sure to take Dr. Lawrence's classes. It would be very beneficial to you if you can get direct lessons from an expert such as him." "Dear, you're talking as if Leyla has already entered college." Mrs. Edman, who had been quietly watching Leyla for some time, sprang into reaction with an unexpected retort. Dr. Edman and Kyle both had their eyes on her. Their expressions were befuddled. "There's no way she'll fail, dear." "Right, Mother. There's no way Leyla will fail." They were ready to debate her with identical facial expressions and tone of speech. Both of her husband and son were like two peas in the pod whenever they paid attention to Leyla. Mrs. Edman was compelled to swallow back the words that had been pushed to her throat. "That's true. Leyla is such a smart girl." She curved the corners of her lips upwards with slight coercion. Sitting across from her, Leyla was a little embarrassed and slightly blushed at her praise. Whenever Layla's past story at Lovetta came up, Bill Remmer always kept his lips shut. Everyone at Arvis Manor knew about Leyla. She had lost her parents overnight and had traveled to Berg after moving from one relative's household to another. And Linda Edman detested this truth of Leyla Lewellin beyond all else. A child with no proper relatives to care for and nurture her. A child who had traveled across the border, and was repeatedly kicked out. She was on the verge of getting chills whenever thinking about how lousy her foundation for starting a family would be. Wouldn't she be getting something too big? Even if Leyla came from an ordinary well-off family, she would still hinder that girl from being together with her son. Linda Edman believed, a girl who grew up without a good background won't become an excellent spouse. Moreover, seeing a scant girl like her who was so eager to study at college, was very irksome to see. Despite her lesser means, watching how Leyla had lofty ambitions that were out of her league, and considering her poor circumstances led Linda Edman to label her as a greedy person. She thought for sure, Kyle would never be able to live happily if such a child would become his wife. "That's why I have to stop it." Mrs. Edman tightened her grip under the table. She had to stop this marriage by all means possible. Leyla Lewellin's acceptance note to university arrived in the mail from the very same postman who had delivered little Leyla to Arvis in the past. Bill Remmer, who received the letter while Leyla was out and in the forest, stood still for a long while. "Mr. Remmer?" The mailman glanced at him with a worried face after Bill didn't give a response after he said his congratulations. His expression that was carefree a moment ago, suddenly became a blazing bright crimson. "Are you okay, Mr. Remmer?" "Well, there's nothing to fuss about." Bill rubbed his eyes with his rough hand. "I was just thinking for a moment." He raised his voice as he spoke. His eyes glistened. The postman, who had known the gardener of Arvis was the bruiser with a soft center, nodded quietly, pretending not to notice a tear which was forming on the corner of his eyes. "Anyway, congratulations. I'm thrilled to know that Leyla is going to be a student at the best university in the empire." After congratulating Bill for a second time, the postman departed from the cottage. Bill glided back to the terrace holding the acceptance letter and sat on his chair. He reread the letter many times and softly stroked the letter typing with his fingers. After taking a deep breath, his face gradually returned to normal, which was getting redder with compassion. That was when Leyla came back. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks, Uncle. Leyla waved her arms up in the air while running as she saw Bill sitting on the terrace. Her old leather bag that was draped over her shoulder swung slightly in rhythm with her running steps. That damned bag, Bill chortled as he hissed faintly. It was his tool bag that he had given to her when she first arrived at Arvis over the summer. Leyla had a few nicer bags than that one, but still, she relied on that old, battered bag every time she went for a stroll in the forest. When are you going to throw away that trash bag? Bill began to ask Leyla, who was sitting next to him. Throw it? She yapped. Why? It's still usable. Now, please throw that bag into the trash. That grody thing could bring you bad luck. I'll use it a little more, Leyla giggled softly as her finger fiddled with the tattered leather bag strap. I'm feeling a little empty without it. Well, I know it sounds like a fool's talk. But, she murmured. Without saying a word, Bill quietly held out the letter in front of her eyes. Uncle, what's this? You'll know when you read it. Leyla blinked at the letter with her eye popping. Bill thought that she would burst out into cheers of joy, but Layla's face just grew more composed as she continued reading the letter of acceptance. Leyla? Bill spoke first, and he did so with some trepidation after he saw her overly muted reaction. Only then did Leyla lift her head and turn to face him. A faint smile appeared on her lips. It would be nice if you were jolly like a little girl in a moment like this. Bill scratched the back of his neck at her silent slant, which was mature enough to make him feel ill at ease. Leyla momentarily smirked at him, who was standing still for a brief moment. Suddenly, she hugged him tightly. Hey, it's stuffy. At odds with his prickly words, Bill tepidly patted her back. Thank you. Leyla raised her head and whispered in a hushed tone. Thank you so much, Uncle. With every glance he gave her, Layla's eyes welled up with tears and her lips melted into a wide grin. It's all thanks to you. You're saying nonsense. Bill gulped for air and started counting in his head. He reflected on the chores he needed to do one by one before the sunset, but the heat in his eyes showed no signs of abating. Now Bill was sure, this little child must have brought her tear bag from Lovida. You were the one who studied hard and earned a passing grade on the exam. What did I do, huh? No. No, Uncle. Leyla shook her head and reached out to take Bill's hand in hers. Her tiny hands had a tough time holding his. She stuttered. The hand she was grasping had flowed a warm feeling that was akin to the tepidness she had after sipping a shot of vodka. Uncle, if it weren't for you, I'd have been. On this happy day, Leyla looked like she's about to cry. Bill didn't like it, and he dreaded the sight of her sobbing face the most. He didn't want to witness Layla's tears, even if they were tears of happiness. His fondness for this child was far greater beyond all the love and care he had devoted to the flowers and trees that he had planted throughout his life. Bill was perplexed knowing he cherished this child more than his precious flowers and trees. It just happened naturally before he knew it, and he was more than happy to accept that fact. Shall we go to the capital together next weekend? Asked Bill in a cheerful tone after coughing a little bit to calm his emotions. Both of us? Layla's pupils dilated. Going to the rats? It left her bewildered. I have to pay your tuition fee since you've been accepted into college. Besides, I haven't brought you to any place yet, so let's go sightseeing around the capital city. Really? Layla's tear-stained face glowed with zest. Uncle, are you serious? We're going on a vacation together? What vacation? He jested. I'm just going to pay your tuition. Whatever it is. All that matters is we're going together. A tinge of regret lingered in his eyes when he looked at Leyla, who was such a happy camper at the moment. He wanted to take her for a walk to a nearby place, show her something interesting, and buy something delicious to eat. But why? Bill questioned himself, lamenting. Why did all of these thoughts occur to him only now? As the day when he would have to let her go from, his arms drew nearer. That's a lot of money, even though the two of you are going to get married. I'm still worried about letting you go alone with Kyle carrying that much money, so I can't help it, but the babbling Bill eventually hooted with laughter. Leyla flung herself once again onto his hug. "Look, Leyla." Bill gave her a lovely smile. "Am I right?" He gently combed her hair with his fingers. "Didn't you say you'll be a good adult?" In the end, he couldn't put it into words, and Bill was at a loss for what to say as well, so he just stroked Layla's head again, over and over again. Bill Remmer needed to count more than ever before to keep his ugly crying face on hold. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 33. Eden of Arvis. Remmer's Leyla had been accepted at Rats University. Within a few moments, the news spread among the people in the Arvis manor. Since it had been widely expected, nobody was surprised to hear that Dr. Edmund's lone son had been accepted into a prestigious medical school with outstanding grades. It was Leyla who topped the talk. In these past few days, she had become the talk of the town wherever people gathered. Even the Duke's greenhouse listened regarding this kind of talk. "I just can't believe it," Norma gasped. Bill Remmer made a great choice by sending an orphan, and moreover, a girl, to a college. Norma Katerina von Herhardt, who wouldn't usually say anything on the street about low-income youngsters, tuned in on today's chatter about Leyla with great interest, just like others. "I supposed she was born under a lucky star." Leyla von Herhardt added a pinch of salt to the table talk. She met her daddy Longlegs and was even now engaged to Dr. Edmund's son. Claudine was quietly sipping her tea next to the Duchess, nodding graciously in accordance, then a radiant smirk appeared on her face. "I'm so glad that a poor kid like her has such good luck." She praised Leyla more sincerely than she had previously done. As luck would have it, the maid who had gone to pick up the kid on Norma's orders returned to the greenhouse just in time. She was with Leyla, who was neatly dressed. "Come here and sit down." Duchess Norma calmly instructed her to take a seat. Elise and Claudine both stared at her, their brows slanted, so as Layla's. "There's nothing wrong with serving this special child a cup of tea, isn't it?" Norma flashed a smile as she said. Like many of her hearts, Katerina von Herhardt was noble to the bone, to say that the blood coursing through her veins must have had a deep blue tint on it. Hence, everyone was astonished with wonder by her willingness to share a tea table with the orphan child raised by her gardener. Ushered by the maid, Leyla sat on her chair, her cheeks flushed with nervousness. "I've heard that getting into Imperial University is very hard, even for the sons of the most illustrious families." Duchess Norma opened the conversation first after the maid placed the cup of tea in front of Leyla. "It was all thanks to Uncle Bill," Leyla responded, as she politely lowered her gaze. "Yes. You must not forget the kindness of your benefactor, Bill Remmer." "Yes, ma'am." "Are you from Lovida?" "My mother was from Lovida, but my father was a Berg." "Same as me." Elise and Claudine both dilated their eyes simultaneously in response to Norma's peculiar words that sounded like a veiled innuendo. People knew Duchess Norma von Herhardt was a marquise of repute and the sole cousin of Emperor Berg. Her mother was a progenitor of Lovida's aristocratic line. No one would dare to draw a parallel line between her to an orphan who was raised from a humble background. "Tell me what you want." The abrupt request from the elderly Duchess, who just laid her teacup down, caught Leyla jerking her head up, startled. "Bill Remmer is my favorite employee," she stated it quietly, "and you're a child he raised like his own daughter, so I should give you a congratulatory gift." Embarrassment immediately rose up to Layla's cheeks. Just in time, she stared at the Duchess. Instead of concealing her eyes, the greenhouse received the arrival of another visitor. Claudine spotted him as he neared them and blurted out, "Duke Herhardt." Claudine's cheery voice got everyone's attention, and their eyes fled to a distinguished man. Leyla swiftly turned her head and saw Matthias von Herhardt standing haughtily near the table. Their eyes met, faces frowned on one another for a host of reasons. The tension persisted between them until Leyla averted her gaze from him. This child had been successfully accepted into Rats University. "So we took her out for tea together because it was something to celebrate," Elise explained in a voice laced with hilarity. After a brief nod, Matthias sat down on a chair beside Claudine, which happened to be the seat facing Leyla. "You're back early today." Claudine gave a warm welcome to her fiancé. Matthias always departed the mansion right after the clock hit the dawn of the day and would always return late at night after he had taken charge of the family's business for good. It had already been a week since Claudine stayed at Arvis, but this was the first time she had seen Matthias come home before gloam. The meeting came to a close earlier than planned. My lady. What a relief. I was worried you might be overdoing it these days. Claudine's right, Matthias, Elise added. Take your time and avoid rushing. If you end up ruining your health, it would be a real concern. Following that, the conversation drifted to Matthias's current situation, with the family-run business and Leyla Lewellin's presence seemed to have been wiped out in a blink of an eye. But thanks to it, Leyla had a moment to catch her breath and take a sip of her already cool tea. She wished she could escape this unpleasant situation, but she knew it would be rude to do so in front of the two duchesses who were keeping a keen eye on her every move. Leyla put her teacup down onto the saucer, cautious not to create any noise within her gestures. When she elevated her sight, she flinched slightly, and her back banged against the chair. Matthias sat quietly between his chattering fiancé and his mother, his callous eyes fixed on her in the same gaze he had on the day he ruthlessly trampled her heart and abandoned her behind. Leyla, who was trying to grab the teacup again, hurriedly slid her hands beneath the table. Matthias was seen speaking to Claudine for a while before turning his attention to his mother and then back to her. She lowered her head, daring not to look at him in the eyes, but Leyla could still feel his menacing glare piercing through her body. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. That gaze served as a constant reminder of her last summer's memories. In the face of Claudine, those memories grew even more humiliating, and Leyla had enough of it. Although the Duke committed wrongdoings, it was always her who felt guilty. So, have you thought about what you want? Norma's questions brought the table's spotlight back to Leyla Lewellin. Leyla clenched her jaw hearing Norma and bit her lip involuntarily as she witnessed Matthias' blue eyes remain glued on her. She immediately switched her look to Norma, attempting to conceal her reddened face. You've already given me a wonderful gift, ma'am. That was more than enough. You already got it? Yes. Just allowing me to stay here in Arvis, in Uncle Bill's cottage, is already a gift I cannot repay. It was the biggest and most precious gift I've ever received and I'll be forever grateful for it my whole life. We just granted Bill Remmer's request. That permission was a gift that changed my life, said Leyla, her lips curved in a faint smile. I'm also very grateful to you, ma'am. She also didn't forget to express her polite gratitude towards Elise. Also to the Duke and Lady Claudine. Somehow, Leyla was more than delighted to express her gratitude to everyone, including those she disliked, rather than asking for permission to leave the place. I won't forget the kindness you have given me, even when the time comes for me to leave Arvis. With a deep bow, she took Norma's question into appreciation. Duchess Norma scrutinized her thoroughly before giving a slight nod. It would be impolite to turn down her heart's favor. Nevertheless, Leyla's courteous attitude seemed to astound her, which she found to be quite commendable for a plebeian young girl. Have you already said goodbye? Claudine asked sadly. You must be sad, Leyla. She kept a silent gaze on her and offered something to her. I understand how you feel, but I still want to give you a present. Oh, how about if I pay for your college tuition? No, miss. The kindness you have shown me has already made me feel very grateful. Leyla looked at Claudine, a smile tightened on her face. Uncle Bill has already saved the tuition money aside. He wants to cover the cost of my first semester of college. Really? I'll have to think of something else to give as a present then, she declared. I can't let my old friend leave empty-handed who had been accepted into college and is about to marry. Isn't that right, Duke Herhardt? Claudine said, her lips curving into a brilliant grin. and her voice calling his name sounded as sweet as a honey. Matthias took a moment glancing at Leyla before he gently gestured his head in agreement with his fiancée. Leyla was eventually allowed to leave that unsettling tea table after many more formal talks and niceties. She was standing with her back to the Herhardt family at the time when her eyes were drawn to the scenic view of the greenhouse. Eden of Arvis. That's what everyone called it. The opulent greenhouse, where people say lavish grandiose praises on one another, left her feeling uneasy and out of breath. The stifling feeling that engulfed her was analogous to the one she had when she saw a lovely crippled winged bird or mixed flowers of colors, its scent stinging her nose. From the gurgling water that was flowing from the marble fountain to the sunshine that was cast in through the surrounding glass windows, the whole 9 yards echoed that sentiment precisely. Leyla strode out of the greenhouse without giving a second glance behind. Only when she clapped her eyes on the glimmer of light outside and smelt the wind blowing over her body did she expel her sigh. Long shadows trailed her footsteps beneath the twilight gloom as she walked into the heart of the forest. "Sister, do you know what you are talking about?" Daniel Rayner was stunned and therefore asked in disbelief. The crepuscular light cascading in through the uncurtained window blinded him and his cousin, Linda Edman, who sat calmly opposite from him. "Sister, tone down your voice, Daniel." Mrs. Edman sternly chastised him as she cast a quick peek through the closed door. Daniel heaved in shock. Daniel Rayner, who had just regained his business's impetus after the failure of his overseas mining venture, had frequently sought help from Linda Edman, his cousin's sister and his wealthiest relative. She, who had consistently rebuffed his appeals graciously yet heartlessly, this time came to visit him first. It went without saying that the promised help won't be returned back. However, Daniel's excitement for taking her helping hand soon turned to hesitation upon hearing Mrs. Edman's improper words. "It's stealing, sister." "How?" "No." Mrs. Edman abruptly cut off his words and narrowed her eyes onto crinkled slits. "It's just a matter of hiding it for a while and returning it." "But don't you care about Kyle too?" "I do. And you, too, need my help," Mrs. Edman said as she lifted her hand from her lap and caressed her heated temple. As foreseen, Daniel Rayner was unable to counter and could only bend his head in shame. "I'm going to keep the money for a while and return it at the right time," she reasoned. "If you can do that simple task, you will be able to safeguard your family, and I will be able to protect my son." Mrs. Edman straightened her sitting posture and looked at Daniel Rayner with a satisfied expression on her face. "I don't think this is a bad deal. What do you think?" Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 34. An excuse for breaking her heart. Like the light of the dusk, a warm smile tinged on his face the minute he found Leyla strolling down the forestry trail. "Leyla!" Kyle yelled her name aloud. Leyla, who was walking with her gaze down staring at the ground, promptly lifted her head and eyes widened. Kyle couldn't keep the grin off his face from adoring that moment. The moment Leyla quickened her stride whenever she got a hold of his presence was always very adorable. Leyla flashed a beaming smile as she neared closer to him. "When did you get here?" "I went to your cottage a while ago and they told me that you had been summoned to the Duke's manor, so I was on my way to save you." "Save me? Isn't it obvious why Lady Brandt called you?" "Not today," said Leyla as she took a step forward. Kyle trailed behind. His stride was perfectly timed with her. "It was Grand Duchess Norma, not Lady Brandt." "Grand Duchess?" "She did?" "Yeah, she congratulated me on passing the exam and asked if there was anything I wanted as a gift." "And what did you say?" "I said nothing. I just conveyed my gratitude for letting me stay here." "Wow, it was so Leyla Lewellin-esque answer." Kyle just smirked at what he had guessed. He gently scooped her hand, and Leyla seemed to be less nervous compared to the past. This small change brought his level of happiness climbed by 1 or 2 notches. They strolled along the familiar road, hand in hand, as they shared stories. It began by their everyday routines, mystery novels published in today's newspapers, and their meager summer plans for this year. As always, the intimate atmosphere snippet mingled with the rhythmic footfall, who was walking alongside one another. Before long, the afternoon sky was broken, and jolted the twilight from its light slumber. When the nightfall dawned, The sea of trees was soon blanketed in its beauty. Kyle yanked Leyla's hand and dragged her into the darkness with him. He leaned her body against the tall tree on the side of the road as she reeled, then stepped in front of her. Everything happened in the blink of an eye, yet Kyle felt as if time had halted still for eternity throughout that moment. Leyla glanced at him, bewildered. "Kyle?" Her voice was trembling a tad as she spoke. Her bonny pink delicate lips glowed attractively even in the pitch blackness of the night. Kyle summoned all his courage and bent his head towards her, his eyes slammed shut. The warm skin soon reached his lips, but he wasn't pleased with the touch he was getting. Kyle opened his eyes and laughed out loud. He found out that his lips had kissed Leyla's hand rather than what he planned. "I felt weird doing this, Kyle." Leyla was gazing at him with her blushing face while her other hand was firmly covering her lips. As Kyle slowly raised his head, once again she spoke, "It seems like we're doing something bad if we do this, and I." Leyla dropped her gaze quietly, unable to bring herself to finish her words. Her pale, long eyelashes were likewise heading down. "Don't you think this is wrong?" When Leyla struggled to swallow the words she so wished to talk, Kyle flashed a grin. The hue of his cheeks now had matched hers in color. "Hey, Miss Lewellin. An innocent person who doesn't know how to kiss like you knows what? Huh? Though you were chattering really loudly in the train back then as if you were an expert." "What do you mean? Oh, gosh." Leyla hunched over to look shorter after recalling the day Kyle wanted to leap off a speeding train after she gave him a lecture about the act of reproduction. That's. Layla's eyes rolled skyward, and she gulped, finding she lacked the right words to debate him. "I'm also not sure about that," she softly whispered. Her habit of muttering low when she was in a position of disadvantage had remained unaltered since their childhood, to which Kyle let out a faint sigh. His heartbeat went loose. It was pathetic that he couldn't kiss the woman he would marry, but Kyle didn't abhor it either. His deepest wish was to win Layla's heart, so he refused to shatter her heart merely because of his fleeting lust. Softly, Kyle fondled her cheeks, wrapping his hands around them. And then, he kissed her. His heated lips found their way to her forehead. He tried his best not to be greedy anymore, and with that, Kyle had kept his promise. As he drew in a steadying breath, the pleasing scent littered his lungs. The sweet scent of roses. It was the scent of Leyla. Matthias gingerly walked towards the window on the west side of his bedroom after taking a shower. His routine went on wontedly. Though he slept off after midnight, he would usually be awake pretty early in the morning. He made his way to the bathroom without losing a beat and took a quick shower before getting ready for the day ahead. It had already evolved into a sort of habit, which he could do effortlessly since it had been ingrained into his bones. Maybe, even right now. Like it had become a habit, Matthias looked over the open window. In his garden surrounded by blossoming rose fields, Leyla was there, hard at work. Perhaps as the day of her departure drew nearer, she had been seen following the gardener much more often recently. The two of them didn't separate for a single second and kept conversing without the slightest pause. He once described Leyla Lewellin as a very reticent child who seldom opened her padlocked lips in front of Claudine. "Master, this is Hessen." He heard the familiar sound of a door knocking at the scheduled hour. "Come on in." Standing with his back against the windows, Matthias gave a succinct response. The chiffon drapes were rattling in the wind that wafted through the open stile. While reading the newspaper Hessen had brought, Matthias overheard the reports about his to-do list for the day. He seemed to be having a laid-back schedule before the luncheon. "It seems that Arvis was completely filled upon the return of its master," Hessen added a word rather than retreating silently as he usually did. Matthias turned to face him, setting down his teacup on the table. "My grandmother and mother would probably be sad if they heard that." "Pardon?" "Oh no, master. I didn't mean that. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site." "Thanks." "I know." A smile crept across Matthias's lips. "I know what you meant." His momentary grin soon melted away, but his eyes stayed riveted on the middle-aged butler calmly. It was placid like a windless night. Hessen hurried off the room, after noticing the look of displeasure in his master's eyes. Even after the bedroom door was closed, Matthias continued reading the newspaper while leaning on the windowsill. His bluish eyes, exposed through the loose strands of his hair, sparkled even brighter when the sunlight hit them. After thoroughly reading the article about Count Klein's business, someone he would have luncheon with, Matthias put down the newspaper. He slowly turned his head and saw Leyla walking into the flower bed near the manor. Her braided hair beneath a straw hat was swinging as she hopped around. The gardener appeared to be shouting something at her, and Leyla answered excitedly. She burst out laughing. Even with the hat shade obscuring her face, Matthias nonetheless could tell she was laughing with a bubbly voice. Matthias' brows furrowed in a scowl. He ruffled his hair and slowly swept it back. Maybe I shouldn't have come back. The thought was running rampant in his head from the second he set foot on the manor ground. His entire life had been meticulously orchestrated. It was analogous to the stairwell leading to a perfect life, and he needed just to tread on it. But the stairwell was twisted, which muddled his steps. And Matthias still couldn't understand why he had taken a choice that broke his perfect life cycle. Now, he may have already broken it long before the night when he tore up the letter extending his military service. It all began from the day he decided to serve an additional year in the military and postponed his wedding, the day when petty desires blindsided him, the day when he approached her, after she fell from her bicycle. Or maybe from the day he didn't even remember. He still desired her. Matthias was keenly aware of the amplitude of his feelings. As such, he desired that she would disappear from his life. And he believed that his desire was something right. His state of shambles was sparked by the inner conflict between his raging emotions and guileless desires. Matthias was unable to provide a definitive answer, but he trusted the passage of time would eventually remedy the matter. The window was slammed shut, and Matthias changed his outfit into a different one. The trellis shade slid over his face as he strode along the colonnade. Luring by his discernment, Matthias left the manor alone and followed the forest trail leading to the river. On the underside of the dazzling moonlight, the dancing shadows loomed sombre. Matthias stalled for quite a while beneath the thick shadow cast by the surrounding trees to get sucked up onto reverie. His world had no concept of longing since he had never had a desire of his own. There was a raw feeling that he had discovered when he was unable to get what he desired. It was a pretty out free zone that had seized possession of his body. Daniel Rayner's countenance grew paler as a ghost as he got closer to the gardener's cottage. The sun wasn't yet scorching, but the sweat was already dampening his forehead. "This is nuts," Daniel mumbled frantic words as the cottage's roof had shown itself from the distance. Mrs. Edmund told him that she wanted to temporarily withhold the tuition money the gardener had prepared, which amounted to nothing more than a stealing act if her discourse was condensed. The noble and graceful Linda Edmund beguiled her cousin into committing a sin in the hope of severing the poor girl's relationship with her son. Daniel Rayner heaved a sigh and entered the cottage's front yard. He took out the handkerchief from his pocket and again wiped his face. His grip on the briefcase stretched tightly. He also felt sorry for Kyle, who had fallen in love with and chosen to marry a girl who wasn't a suitable fit for him. Despite their low social standing, everyone expected that the Edmund family would have a daughter-in-law who was nonetheless a silk stocking. However, it was something Kyle sincerely wanted, and Dr. Edmund supported it. He believed that Leyla Lewellin deserved to be their son's companion. Mrs. Edmund, too, acquiesced in her husband's decision. But, who knows? A hidden dagger may be lurking behind her benign smile. Money is your foe. After a moment of despondence, and making up his mind, Daniel gallantly strode towards the cottage. Linda Edmund said that the cottage would be vacant in the morning. So if Leyla happened to be there, Daniel only needed to reason that he had just returned from Edmund's home and dropped by to congratulate her on getting into college. It wasn't a suspicious excuse, given that they had met and known each other before. With cautious, Daniel knocked on the front door. Guilt seeped into his veins as he prayed Leyla was inside, and this scheme would fail. Yet, the thing that greeted him inside the house was all quietness. Daniel then pulled on the doorknob, and feelings of despair and hopelessness started to blend into one. As his sister had assured him, the door was unlocked. "But, sis, didn't you mention that even if the money was stolen, Someone would undoubtedly help her in paying her tuition? Even Dr. Edmund was willing to pay for her tuition fees. Linda Edmund stiffened her cheeks with a bitter smile when Daniel questioned her in bewilderment. I know my husband better than you. But why? The missing tuition was just an excuse. Huh? An excuse to break her heart. A sigh punctuated his silent reply. Daniel refused to comment and could only blink slowly. He had no interest to become involved in their household matters, and this shameful deed just made him feel more guilty and disappointed in himself. But he kept grasping at straws, although it made him feel like a despicable person. He was only helping his cousin's sister to keep the gardener's money for the time being. Daniel recited that rationalization thought 1,000 times in his head before summoning the courage to enter the house. He completed the job quickly. Daniel breathed a sigh of relief after successfully leaving the cottage with a bag of money. He had rolled the dice and succeeded in his role on the game board. He just has to hand over the scruffy cash to Linda Edmund and then go home, content in the knowledge that his laborious efforts to protect his family would be repaid in full in the near future. Daniel opted for a loop along the riverside to avoid a situation where he might encounter the gardener. Worse luck. His prudent choice landed him in a pickle when he met paths with a young man near the river. Seeing Daniel Rayner, the young man stopped his sluggish steps. Without even a speck of suspicion or surprise in his face, the young man stood still and regarded him stoically. Is he one of Arvis's employees? It was not long after his momentarily nonchalant attitude soothed him. Daniel's complexion soon grew like a death warmed up. Wearing a comfy shirt, that young man didn't look like a servant as he strolled down the riverside at the busy time to start the day. Moreover, his princely face had all the hallmarks of the familiar figure he recognized. The very face that was featured countless times in newspapers and which he could only see on many occasions from a distance. The young owner of a heaven-like place called Arvis. It was Duke Herhardt. Cry. Even better if you beg. Chapter 35. What the thief stole. From the previous several days, Leyla Lewellin's name was once again marching briskly through the tongues of Arvis's workers. This time, with a radically different narrative. Now, the outline was, the gardener's cottage had been burgled. The news traveled fast around the manor like a wildfire. The incident was met with people's doubts. Few believed a thief had the nerve to steal from Duke Herhardt's estate. Only until they saw a half-dazed Bill Remmer looking for the culprit did they believe the robbery really happened. Matthias departed the mansion at the peak of the clamor. The scheduled time had come, and he must leave now to avoid being late for lunch. He wasn't the kind to chime in on gossipy talks, sensing something different upon passing the Arvis's driveway flanked by platanus trees. From the opposite side of the road, police officers on horseback were making their way toward the scene. Matthias didn't even have to make logical assumptions of where they were going since the route would lead them to the Arvis forest. They said a thief broke into the gardener's house. The quick-witted aide answered first before Matthias could open his mouth to ask. At Bill Remmer's house? Yes, he was in a big pickle since the funds he'd set aside for his daughter's college tuition were stolen. Thief. Tuition. Leyla. Matthias tilted his head to one side, elatedly repeating those 3 syllables. Just as his vehicle exited the platanus shade, he recalled his unpleasant encounter with a strange man on the Shelter River this morning. The guy introduced himself as Daniel Rayner, Mrs. Edmund's cousin. He was in the neighborhood paying a visit to Edmund's house and stopped by the estate to congratulate Leyla. His following few speeches were full of baloney: the investment firm he ran, the mining rights of overseas mines, the stock market, and other business-related matters. But most of them had been spilled and were now just a blot on Matthias' mind. Matthias did, nevertheless, remembered a few details about the event. His wristwatch read 9 o'clock in the morning when he met a middle-aged man drenched in sweat by the riverside. It seemed strange for a well-heeled middle-class businessman to bother coming just to congratulate his cousin's future daughter-in-law at such an early hour. Matthias, however, didn't mind it since it was irrelevant to him. He treated the thought as a passing interest until he overheard a ludicrous report of a burglar sneaking into the gardener's cottage. But why? As a civilized business person, Sneaking into Arvis to steal the gardener's money seemed so wrong no matter how dear his financial circumstance was. If he were him, Matthias would instead steal from the house of his wealthy cousin sister, Leyla Lewellin. He was ready to quit on thinking such a nonsensical idea when he muttered that name without knowing. After he inserted Leyla Lewellin's name between that guy and Leyla, Matthias was able to draw a very plausible relationship line between the three of them. He was just guessing. Yet, it was fascinating how perfectly fit the jigsaw pieces were in place together. The car finally reached their stop in front of the hotel, where his appointment for the luncheon will take place. Before stepping out, Matthias issued a short order to his assistant. Evers. Yes, master. Find out about Daniel Rayner. ASAP. The food on the dinner table was left nearly untouched, but it was hard to get up from the table where Bill and Kyle used to dine together. Leyla, who was well aware of the cause, quietly cleaned the table. Leaving his half-eaten plate, Bill Remmer went straight to the porch and lit up a cigarette. Since the thief broke in, the mood in their cottage had lost its thrill. It's all right, Leyla. Kyle spoke cautiously as he helped her. Layla's hard-working hands screeched to a pause, and she lifted her emerald eyes to meet his. That thief, I'm sure we can catch him. Even if we are unable to arrest him, don't fret about the tuition. My father said that he will also pay yours. Kyle, don't try to say no. My father wanted to pay for it from the very beginning. But Uncle Bill was so stubborn that my father caved. Kyle firmly argued, to get married means being family, Leyla. It's not about being in debt, it's about helping each other. Isn't that how families should be? Leyla lowered her gaze, stood still and finally nodded her head slowly. Her face had grown so gaunt in a matter of days, fueling Kyle with hatred for the robber who had despoiled the woodland's peacefulness. Anyway, just in case, let's just think about how to catch the thief first. Kyle expressed his optimism by saying, even though he knew that the odds of catching the thief were very slim. Leyla gave a sliver smile. Thanks, Kyle. Thank you? What did I do? For everything. Once again, a grin crept on her lips. Yet her smiling face caused Kyle's heart to feel heavy. Kyle clearly remembered the tinge of happiness plastered on Layla's face at the idea of coming to the capital with Uncle Bill. Though Uncle Bill downplayed his trip by claiming it was to pay for her tuition, in truth, it was their very first family vacation. Uncle Bill couldn't express his elation well, owing to his blunt personality, but undoubtedly, he was thrilled to go on a trip with Leyla, to the point that he teased her, and claimed that she would make an excellent guide for him since this would be her second visit to Rats. Places to visit, foods to try, and activities to do together were all must-to-do. Kyle almost got jealous at Uncle Bill witnessing how endearing was Leyla when she was talking with passion bad giddily with him. But, the thief ruined everything. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Even if they could get the money back, Leyla and Uncle Bill couldn't go on a trip with such pleasure, and Kyle couldn't do anything about it. Kyle shook off his boundless helplessness as he caught his breath and approached Bill, who was sitting suddenly on the porch. He cast a look at Kyle, who was seated next to him before he resumed heaving the cigar. Depression had been consuming him for the recent days. Inside him, a boiling hatred against the thief was brewing, to the point he devised hundreds of different methods to kill people. After some silence, he spoke. It was all my fault. His voice was choking. I left a lot of money at home, but didn't properly lock the door. You weren't at fault. Who would have thought someone would dare to steal in the Arvis estate? The payment deadline is next week, and I'm not sure if the thief will be caught before then. Don't worry about that. If there's no progress in catching the thief before then, my father said that he would pay Layla's tuition as well. I've told Leyla about this. Kyle's beaming face drove Bill Remmer's eyes to sink beyond a deep well. I will call the police tomorrow. I will ask our officer acquaintance to properly investigate this case. Thank you, Kyle. I owe it all to your family. I feel bad to hear that. I haven't even paid half the price of the food I ate all this time. At his witty, Bill could smile a bit, albeit, it was a weak smile. Please convey my gratitude to your parents. Ah no, please tell them I will pay them a visit once this matter is settled. He squeezed Kyle's shoulder as he said so. Kyle nodded, dissuading him from saying, "You shouldn't." He couldn't pinpoint why, but he had that unexplained feeling about Bill Rimmer. Kyle also didn't want to offend him in any way. The Duke's manor had 2 study rooms. The study on the second floor was a spacious, book-filled space that rivaled the scale of a public library. The second one, that was located at the end of the 3rd floor next to the master bedroom, was less in size. The library, that was loaded chiefly with history, politics, and economics books, had been used by Duke of Herhardt for generations as a place for receiving guests and conducting business meetings. Similarly, Duke Matthias von Herhardt did. Mark Evers, the Duke's aide, rushed off his feet to the 3rd floor office. He seemed in demand. He had been Matthias's assistant since he was fully fledged. But never once did the Duke give him orders in such haste like now. All along, Matthias always presented him the image of an easygoing master with an innately laid-back attitude. But soon, he realized. Perhaps, that was because nothing existed under the skies of the Berg Empire that could make Duke Herhardt chomp at the bit. To be very eager or impatient to do something. Matthias von Herhardt was a man of influence. He had it all, and everything he did went as slick as a whistle. Mark Evers deemed that his master's generosity and kindness stemmed from there. His calm wolfish predator persona led him to feel the air move slowly whenever he was around Matthias. It was Duke Herhardt, whom he was familiar with. Hence, when Matthias added the term ASAP to his order, Mark Evers briefly questioned his ears. After his brain processed hard, he quickly grew impatient and frantically began investigating Daniel Rayner. "Master, this is Evers." Mark Evers galloped to the Duke's office on the 3rd floor and knocked on the door. A light source glinted through the door plate, but no answer came from behind the closed jamb. In other words, it meant yes. He slowly threw open the door and entered the office. Matthias was sloping on the spacious leather sofa. It was a brisk night, yet he was still clad in formal attire from his previous meeting with a business partner. "It's about Daniel Rayner, as you asked." Mark Evers politely placed the file folder he was carrying on the table. Matthias dropped his hand from his temple and took the document. He then started flipping the pages. His stance, attentively scanning the papers in his hands, was definitely that of the Duke Herhardt Mark Evers knew. But the peace was short-lived, and Mark Evers was soon thrust into a direful scene. Matthias busted a gut as he reached the last page of reading. He had no clue why misfortune was playing such a cruel joke on Daniel Rayner, enticed by foreign mining investment but duped, then detained and forced to give up his house as collateral. He invested a huge sum of money and ended up in Queer Street. In difficulty, typically by being in debt. What a gut-wrenching loss. Daniel Rayner. It seems he has paid off all of his bank debt recently. Matthias folded the document in his hand. One of his lips curled upward. His expressionless face was quite gentle, but when he giggled like it was entertaining, he portrayed an image of himself as a cold-hearted person. "Yes, master. I'd like to report it to you." He didn't pay off the whole balance, but it was big enough to save his house from being seized. "It happened this afternoon, and therefore, I am unable to include it in the report." "The amount of cash must come from Etman," said Matthias. He continued, "Linda Etman." Matthias spoke the name slowly and gave a Bronx cheer. "So, what should I?" "Good job. Call Hassan." Instead of responding, Matthias gave another command. Although he looked puzzled, Mark Evers followed the call, and he didn't ask anything. Cry. Even better if you beg. Chapter 36. So, then, did you find it, master? Hassan entered the office shortly after Mark Evers's left. "What happened to the thief who stole Bill Rimmer's money?" queried Matthias in an undertone. "The officers are already on the site, but they are having a difficult time finding evidence and eyewitnesses." "Then what about Leyla Lewellin's tuition money?" "If the thief is not caught, the madam and Miss Brandt both said that they want to pay the tuition. And I think Dr. Etman was equally willing as well." Nothing in his report seemed surprising. Jutting his chin, Matthias giggled and put down the file. Linda Edman was the scheme's brain. Matthias fixed on based from information he got about the stupid stranger he had met that morning. Mrs. Edman seemed to be pleased with his son's marriage at first glance. But who would have expected that her revealing true stripes would be much more toxic and menacing? Though it's unrelated to him, but Matthias didn't want to miss the spectacle of their household's intriguing drama. The look on Layla's face gave an impression that she was all-knowing. Yet, in reality, she was completely clueless about how the world went about its job. Should he now refer to her as a fool? As he took Matthias' silence as a kind of opposition, Hessen braved to ask, "Master, if the rule is different?" "No." Matthias cut him short. A sneer surfaced on his lips. "I respect grandmother's wishes. I'm not against it." From the time he said it, Matthias was inwardly in no doubt. Linda Edman must have planned the plot wisely without a lapse in her forethought. The chess piece she had bought with her cash was a kind of a moron, but not with her very precise and bold scheme. She wasn't naive enough to be ignorant that many people would gladly pay for Leyla Lewellin's lost tuition. She must already be aware of it just by looking at her husband. So what's her true purpose? Matthias touched the tip of his chin, having her inside his brain. Why would Linda Edman create such a fuss when she knew it's hardly possible to hinder Leyla from going to college with Kyle Edman even if her money was stolen? Matthias pursed his lips as if faced with an enticing riddle. "Put someone on Mrs. Edman," announced Matthias as he elegantly crossed his legs. His unamused visage was gentler than the recent command that escaped from him. "Mrs. Edman? Are we talking about Dr. Edman's wife, our family doctor?" "Yes. Linda Edman. The doctor's wife." His plain-spoken reply made Hessen stagger somehow. "There's just one thing you need to report." Matthias rested his tired back against the sofa. A grin was tightly plastered around his face. He said, "Does Mrs. Edman meet with Leyla Lewellin separately? And what she talks about if she does?" The next day at dawn, the police officers returned to Arvis. They visited the Duke's manor and came upon Matthias by chance when he was descending from the stairway to the grand lobby. "Good morning, Duke." A man with silver hair who was the commander of the police officers gallantly greeted him. "Well, I felt ashamed by the theft incident." Matthias paused his steps in the middle of the hall, followed by Claudine and his attendants. Hessen made a subtle approach and said, "They want to ask permission to do another investigation to find eyewitnesses." Matthias nodded approvingly, "Sure, as much as you want." "Thank you, Duke." Upon the salute from their commander in the front row, the young officers at the rear dipped their heads quickly. Matthias was about to continue his stride when the silver-haired officer lifted his head and suddenly addressed him. "So, Duke." Matthias turned his gaze back. His face had a calm demeanor. "Did you see anyone suspicious in the estate that morning?" The hesitant officer posed the question cautiously. Matthias took a second, then made his way slowly up to him. "I saw it." That was a simple answer he should have given. However, Matthias just smiled gracefully instead. He mulled his thoughts regarding Leyla Lewellin for a while. What should I do? What if he exposed Mrs. Edman and her early bankrupt cousin's conspiracy to thwart her son's marriage now? Though the dire situation was on her hand, Linda Edman could still settle things as long as she wouldn't show her real fangs in front of Leyla. There would likely be some uproar, but Matthias believed that it would be for a brief moment. Dr. Edman and his son would strive to make sure the marriage will happen. However, Linda Edman was not the kind of person to give up. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Then Matthias looked up to the ceiling, and his gaze was drawn to the chandelier's light. Leyla Lewellin had gained a once-in-lifetime windfall. She would live happily ever after. Mrs. Edman wouldn't be able to meddle after the two of them moved into their newlywed residence in Rats. Kyle Edman would be a devoted husband who loved and cherished his wife. With the spillage of his love, Leyla would be able to study as much as she wished and perhaps pursue her dream of becoming a scholar. Matthias raised his gaze to the ornate inscription chiseled on the ceiling, high above the chandelier lampshade. He surely could help Leyla if he were willing to trouble himself a bit. Before Linda Edman met her, Matthias had the privilege of meeting Kyle's mother ahead. Linda Ettman would likely withdraw quietly without fanfare if she knew Duke Herhardt had discovered all her schemes, and at least to save her face. It seemed to be a viable way to lessen Leyla's wounds. Matthias gave the officer a once-over without a word being spoken. The senior officer stood in the state, interpreting that the Duke's silence was a reprimand for his rudeness. Matthias knew what makes Leyla happy, and he could save her source of happiness just with a single flick of his fingers. So then, Matthias's lips were drawn onto another smirk. What pleasure can he gain from helping Leyla in finding her happiness? All that remained in him was the dreary roses season in the absence of her, which would be a fissure in his idyllic world. I saw no one, Matthias replied curtly, as his eyes narrowed while staring at the officer. The faces of people watching them were a mixture of worry and soon relief. Yes. Well, thanks for your understanding, Duke. My apologies for all of my rudeness. Matthias accepted his apologies with a kind nod. Have you ever seen a stranger? The officer's cooperative attitude had prompted him to pose the same question to Claudine, who stood behind Matthias. No. Claudine answered without a moment's pause. Unfortunately, I don't have any information that can help your investigation. She gave Matthias a passing glimpse before turning to look at the officer with a smiling face. After the case was closed, Matthias then resumed walking. The officers were left to question the employees, and Matthias got into the car which was parked outside the front door. You didn't forget your promise, did you? Claudine kindly reminded him about their afternoon appointment, to join Riet for dinner after drinking tea together. Of course I remember, my lady. Claudine's face lit up at Matthias' answer. The car sped away from the estate's main gate, and soon departed the estate. Matthias averted his gaze out of the window as the car drove down the road passing through the doctor's residence. Linda Ettman wished for an amount of fun beyond her wildest dreams as a reward for her wait-and-see hard work. She donned a stylish lilac dress. Her face had some light wine makeup, and her chosen hat was both classy and modest in style. Her appearance wasn't supposed to be showy. However, her elegance barely made her appear shabby in her attire today. Mrs. Ettman admired her reflection in the mirror for the second before stepping out of the bedroom. Today she chose to walk rather than take the carriage. The place she was going to wasn't a crowded one. She would go unnoticed from all eyes, so she purposely cherry-picked a location distant from the cottage as she needed a quiet place to meet Leyla. Mrs. Ettman was a million miles away as she waited for the carriage at the stop. She had started everything, and with no way to turn back, she was left with no choice but to go ahead. For her son, Kyle. The carriage came shortly when she sought to gather her wits. Mrs. Ettman climbed into the carriage, and from her mouth came out a slight sigh within her breath. She was willing to go to any length for Kyle even if she were to become a villainess. The tea shop that Mrs. Ettman told was located a couple of miles away from the downtown area. Leyla arrived earlier than their appointment time, so she sat at the table near the sunny window, waiting for Mrs. Ettman's arrival. Rows of brick houses draped in ivy were lined the opposite side of the narrow road. It was barely wide enough for a wagon to pass. Stores with rustic and plain signage padded the left and right sides of the alley. Likewise, the tea shop. The fading paint, worn furniture, and antique windows, as well as the tea-stained tablecloths, to name a few things. It was a place that didn't seem to be to Mrs. Ettman's liking. Why did she choose this place? Leyla decided not to be biased despite her cryptic feelings. The more she thought about it, the more anxious she became. She was averse to adding more to her already overburdened minds about the thievery. So, Leyla didn't want to continue assuming the worst that may happen. Mrs. Ettman may need a private talk with her in a less crowded place. There was undoubtedly plenty of things to discuss, and Leyla's thoughts that were trapped by the paralysis of analysis were shortly disturbed by the clatter of a chime. She sprang to her feet, thinking it was Mrs. Ettman who was coming. Instead, a young man walked into the shop. He was dressed conservatively in a suit complete with a fedora hat. He took a seat at a corner table and then opened a newspaper. Leyla slumped on her chair. Her eyes were fixed on the tea stains on the tablecloth. She went to the police station today, but the case made no significant progress thus far. The lack of witnesses and evidence made it difficult for them to catch the thief. A policeman who took pity on her kindly advised, "It's better not to cling to a shaky hope and find someone else to lend her money urgently." "Should I?" Dr. Edmund, together with Duchess Norma and Lady Claudine, said that they would instead pay for her tuition. This morning, Madame Mona also visited her. She sweetly consoled Leyla and Bill by telling them if the thief wasn't caught, Arvis's workers had committed to fundraising for her college. Their kindness weighed heavily on her heart. When her deep sorrow was expressing itself through a sigh, the bell sounded again. Leyla jumped up from her chair reflexively and turned around. "Hello, Mrs. Edmund." Leyla faintly smiled and bowed her head. The real Mrs. Edmund was now standing in front of the open door. "Cry. Even better if you beg." Chapter 37. I really hate you. Mrs. Edmund froze and glared at Leyla before walking to the chair and sitting on it. She straightened her posture and put her hat on the other chair. Different nuances presented by Mrs. Edmund when she saw her today left Leyla feeling uneasy. "You've probably just returned from the police station." Mrs. Edmund spoke first. "How's the investigation going on?" "They haven't found any clues yet," Leyla said. "But it's not over yet, so I don't want to give up." "Well, Leyla, I don't think it is a wise choice." "Pardon?" Taken aback, Leyla asked once again when the tea she had ordered came. An awkward silence prevailed between the two until the waiter left after carelessly dropping the cup on the table. "May I ask what you mean, ma'am?" Leyla breached the stillness first. "Your money, I have it." Mrs. Edmund uttered those without a trace of guilt. Her sight dipped to the clouded boiling steam of the teacup. Leyla's face was soon obscured by fluster. The words she had clearly heard sounded just like a delusion. Mrs. Edmund lifted her gaze to Leyla and again firmly said, "I was the one who stole your tuition." "No, that can't be. How could someone like you do that?" Her stiff lips tried to smile. Leyla was unable to understand how Mrs. Edmund could make such a bad joke. Yet, Mrs. Edmund's eyes were chilling. "I hid it. I knew it was wrong, but I wanted to prevent you from going to college with Kyle." "No, that can't be." "Yes, it's stealing, a pathetic and cruel theft. Nevertheless, I did it. I want to keep you away from Kyle." Leyla's mind went completely blank. The gruesomely obvious truth said by Mrs. Edmund jolted her awake, and she decided that she could no longer keep on living in denial. "Leyla, I hate you." Mrs. Edmund stared at Leyla. Her disappointment and fatigue were epitomized in her grayish eyes. "I really hate you to the point that I believe it would be better for me to be a criminal than to accept you as Kyle's wife." "And Mrs. Edmund, I thought you were a good girl who knew her place. I never thought that you were trying to use Kyle as a launching pad for your greed." "What do you mean, ma'am?" Leyla fiercely shook her head. "No, I'm not like that. How could I think like that about Kyle? I could never." She got the shock of her life and failed to notice her hands trembling at the edge of the table as well as her entire body starting to shudder. "Are you friends with Kyle for this purpose? Using Kyle to go to college and marrying Kyle to improve your humble status in life?" Mrs. Edmund chastised and cornered the wordless Leyla even more harshly. Though she knew that Leyla's feelings for Kyle stayed within the bounds of brotherhood or friendship in the past. Rather it was her son, Kyle, who fell head over heels in love with her, instead of Leyla. Leyla would not be caught up in this presumptuous affair if it weren't for her bumbling son. It was always this truth that wounded her self-esteem, and now it became the reason why she loathed Leyla even more. "My hatred for you has turned me into a thief. I resent you enough to do this, and that will never change. Do you think we can become a family like this?" "What do you want to tell me, ma'am?" Leyla's voice trembled, but she kept a straight face before Mrs. Edmund. "You must already know. You are a smart girl," Mrs. Edmund stated briefly. Her eyes shone as cold as the untouched cup of cheap tea, while looking at her. "If you have something to say, just tell me," said Leyla. Her glassy, round eyes glimmered in the rays of sunshine that fell upon her despondent face. the ugly face she wished to conceal at the moment. "You can tell Kyle and the rest of the world that I did such despicable acts to stop you two from getting married. You'll never be able to do that." Mrs. Edmund looked confident through her words as she knew Layla's personality. "Kyle will be very disappointed with me if you tell him regarding this," she recited. "Our relationship will all but be broken, and maybe even our whole family's harmony." Mrs. Edmund's expression became colder as she saw Layla stiffening. "Since all of this has happened, it makes no difference whether you keep this a secret or tell Kyle everything. You and Kyle won't be able to get married. That's all I want." "Do you hate me so much that you have to do this?" "Didn't I already tell you? I really hate you." Mrs. Edmund rose from her seat and walked away. "I hate you terribly. You pushed me to take such an extreme choice. I really despise you, Layla." Mrs. Edmund stared at her with a steely gaze. Her eyes could not hide her contempt. "I will refund your money after the registration date." She swallowed the curse words that were already on the tip of her tongue, knowing Layla would have understood that she should leave Kyle without wasting time or making a scene out of it. Mrs. Edmund was about to turn around when she groaned and lowered her eyes down. "Today, I'm very resentful of Mr. Rimmer," she said. "Why did he have to take you in and create such a tragedy in Arvis?" Those last words hit Layla the hardest. Her eyes froze and then turned glassy in a blink. Mrs. Edmund strolled out of the tea parlor leisurely, leaving the poor little girl behind, who didn't weep till the very end. In her wake a tinge of pleasure and guilt was clinging like a shadow on the tips of her toes as she went. He saw Layla. Her petite frame was crouched down beneath the blooming dry cottonwood tree on the roadside leading to the manor. Matthias, who was peering out the car window, did recognize her figure. All he could see was her back, but he felt confident that it was her. "Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks." "Doesn't that girl under that tree look like Layla?" The driver frowned as he kept an eye on a girl he seemed to know. "Is she sick?" Mark Evers, the Duke's aide, wondered as well, so his voice was filled with concern. Meanwhile, their car edged closer to Layla, who was curled up on the ground. Layla quickly stumbled up and straightened stiffly when she sensed their upcoming approach. She bent her head so deep that they couldn't see her swollen face, but it was noticeable that she wasn't fine. Following that, Mark Evers continued to look out the car window before turning his gaze to the rear seat. He was reluctant to ask his master, but his eyes were filled with hope that they could stop the car for a moment and help Layla. The driver's thinking seemed to be in tune and he steadily slowed down the car's speed. Matthias glanced outside the car window at the slow-moving scenery beyond. Layla was leaning against the trunk of the tree with her head down. She was crying. Matthias was sure of what he had seen on her face. Nobody else in this world had a better understanding of Leyla Lewellin's tears than he did. Matthias clammed up. He turned his gaze away from the car window in place of his answer. His assistant couldn't add any more words, with only a sad expression on his face. The driver, likewise, accelerated the car's speed to comply with his master's wishes. Matthias immensely enjoyed Layla's tears, as he always did. It entertained him. But he wanted to monopolize her tears for his own pleasure. The idea of someone else having to step in to create those kinds of entertainment wasn't pleasurable. The car fled the scene, leaving Layla alone with her tears, and soon stopped at the mansion's entrance. Matthias stepped out of the limousine, with a face that appeared more relaxed. Linda Edmund, has she taken action? That was the only explanation he could think of for Layla to cry until her shoulders sagged. And his guess seemed to be right. It was proven by Hessen, who approached him with a concerned face. Master, I have something to report. He spoke secretly in a hushed voice as he walked beside Matthias. It is an unbelievable story, I'm at a loss for words. When the voice of his capable butler, who seldom panicked, shook a little, Matthias knew that Mrs. Edmund had lived up to his expectations. I'm going to the office. Matthias said so in matter-of-factly, gentle voice. Got cold during summer, huh? It's all because of that damn thief that you're sick like this. Bill, who strutted around Layla's bed, said. He became concerned when Layla said that she was ailing and after he saw her going to bed early last night. Layla said she had a cold and would recover with a bit of rest, but in Bill's opinion, her condition did not seem to be getting any better. You can't be like this. Mr. Edmund. No. Leyla struggled to rise from the bed when Bill was about to turn around. She was shivering even with her thick pajamas, even though the weather had been relatively warm since it was still the wee hours of the morning. She looked as if she had gotten ill overnight. No, Uncle. Don't do that. I just wanted to call the doctor because you're sick? Why? Do you have a fight with Kyle? No. Even though you fought with Kyle, but Dr. Edmund. Uncle, please. Leyla's clammy hand, drenched in a cold sweat, groped Bill's clothes. I just need a little rest. That's it. Please let me be. Leyla, I think I'll get better soon. Please. Bill could no longer stay stubborn in the face of her desperate begging. He had a hunch it had to be related to Kyle, but he wasn't in a place to unearth it. He grudgingly nodded, and Leyla seemed relieved just then. Bill could feel a searing pain in his heart when he saw her lying limp on the bed as if she'd fainted. Right, eat well. Sleep well. I should have said that, Bill yelled aloud. I'm going to sort it all out. I was on the verge of bursting within now. He pulled up the blanket seam with careful gestures that contrasted with his rough hand and then put a wet towel on her feverish forehead. Don't worry, sweetheart. Even if I can't catch and kill the thief, I will pay your tuition in some way. Uncle. Leyla's frail voice blended with her heated breaths. Please stay here. Don't leave me alone. You are thinking negatively again. I'm sorry, Uncle. What gibberish are you talking about? It was because of me. If you keep saying that, I'll get angry. I'll come back for sure. Bill regarded Leyla as lying and babbling, and then heaved a deep sigh that silenced her. First, take a rest, Leyla. I'll be right back. Bill shut the window in Leyla's room and draped the curtains to cover it. I'm stuffy. Please open it up a bit. Leyla, who was shivering from the cold, asked him once again to open it. Her stubbornness persisted even as she lay weak on the bed. Bill had to yield to her pig-headedness for the nth time. Again he rolled up the curtains a bit and partly opened the window, and finally, Leyla closed her eyes. If your fever's not coming down by the evening, whatever you say, I'll call Mr. Edmund. Got it? He threatened her, but Leyla stayed quiet as if she hadn't heard him. Bill then reluctantly left the house, leaving Leyla, who was already dozing off like a log. He hastened off, determined to complete today's job as soon as possible. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 38. The time when I loved you. Accurate predictions may sometimes be displeasing. Matthias suddenly realized that this morning, when he was gazing down at the rose garden without Leyla Lewellin, he had his doubts if she would show herself up for now, after being such a downer. Matthias had guessed it at the moment he heard Hessen's report in his office last night. Nevertheless, witnessing Leyla's absence with his own two eyes had given him some annoyance. She's pretty damn stupid. While laughing, Matthias rolled down the thin curtain then turned around. Linda Edmund's heist was a ruse. Breaking Leyla Lewellin's heart and tarnishing her pride was her true purpose. She devised another plan after her failure to stop his son. It would be Leyla who needed to be stopped. Matthias delightedly applauded and gave a hats off to Mrs. Edmund's great approach. She had a superb hold on her opponent and stabbed her blade precisely on the target. Her hostility towards Leyla bestowed him with a lot more entertainment than he had expected. Matthias couldn't keep the laughter from escaping his lips as he listened to Hessen's report yesterday night. His leisurely weekend morning felt particularly lengthy and stodgy. After changing his clothes, Matthias was once again gazing out of his window while drinking his coffee. Only Bill Remmer and the garden's employees were there, but Leyla was nowhere to be seen. Was he too greedy in his desire for someone as pathetic as her? Matthias took a little morning stroll while mocking her sorry state of affairs. Usually, he would stop by the annex to swim in his spare time. The servants who were well acquainted with their master's routines would flee as soon as they saw him approaching. He wished to see Leyla cry so he could have some good time today. As he was taking pleasure as the wind blew in, Matthias happened to arrive at the gardener's cottage. The house without Leyla lounging on the porch while reading a book or doing chores diligently in the yard, was much too quiet. Matthias' annoyance rose a little. It was when a white pigeon suddenly flew into the house. The bird flew straight towards the window at the back of the cottage as if it had a specified destination. Without a second's hesitation, Matthias made a beeline to where the bird had passed. It perched calmly in the half-open window, and he noticed a note attached to the bird's leg. Beyond the window was Leyla's room. The pigeon didn't flee as Matthias approached it. Carrier pigeon? Matthias looked at the bird with a scowl before gently catching it. Although being in human hands, the pigeon was very docile. Matthias stared carefully at the note the bird brought before a sudden cry from the window jarred him out from his muse. Matthias lifted his head, and he found Leyla sniveling and laying in bed like a dead person in her room that he had previously thought was empty. Leyla opened her eyes and laid still. Her gaze was glued to the ceiling for some time. The room was lathered in blinding light. The sound of birds chirping in the tree outside the window was clear and lively, like the summer sunshine in the morning. As her dreamlike senses reawakened one by one, the bitter truth that she had forgotten due to her sickness slowly revived. How strange. Leyla felt more at ease when the reality before her eyes grew clearer. The plethora of emotions that had filled the gap in her breath melted away in the guise of cold sweat and tears that broke out without her realizing it. It had been about 3 days had passed. Leyla was counting how much time she had spent laying on bed before slowly raising her body and sitting down. She momentarily felt a little bit groggy but soon regained her composure. She took a look at her bed sheet and thought that it needed to be laundered. The windowsills should be wiped as they had become dusty. The dish that Uncle Bill had washed before wasn't clean enough, so she had to polish it again to get rid of any residual stains. And for a short spell, Leyla was stunned and closed her eyes, thinking of the many tasks she needed to do. When she reopened her eyes, she calmly decided that one thing should take priority above all else. She has to meet Kyle. You can't go around like this yet, Leyla. You should rest. Kyle speeded up his steps when he spotted Leyla sitting by the stream. Leyla was looking down at her reflection in the water, slowly raising her head to face him. She was pale-faced, with visible symptoms of sickness. Why did you come all the way here? Kyle hurriedly walked over to her side. I can meet you at home. With her knees clasped together, Leyla was sitting on the wide, flat rock by the river. Her wavy, silky golden hair, which draped naturally over her slender shoulders, was like a part of the gleaming afternoon sun. I have something to tell you. Leyla spoke as she stared at him solemnly, without her usual smile. So, what amazing thing are you going to say? Kyle laughed on behalf of her, who showed no sign of mirth. Leyla gazed at him without a word, turning up her nose to join in the laughter. Without the slightest hint of a bad feeling, Kyle broadened his grin. Meeting somewhere else like this is nice at times, but you're still unwell. That's what concerns me, Kyle. Anyway, I had something to convey as well. How fortunate we are to be able to talk here. Kyle. Don't worry about the stolen money, Leyla. Tomorrow my father is going to Rats. Your tuition will. Kyle, I'm not going to college. Kyle's words were cut off by Leyla. What? Kyle, who was sitting beside her and watching the river flow, tilted his head. Both exchanged glances. A heavy silence rang between them in a moment as their trapped gazes were locked on each other. I'm not going to college. What are you talking about? You passed that difficult exam. Don't worry about the tuition fees. Leyla, please, don't be so stubborn like I won't marry you either. Leyla straightened her knees and wrapped her fallen scarf around her neck. I'm going to stay here with Uncle Bill, and live the life I've always dreamt of. I'm sorry, Kyle. I should have told you this from the beginning, but I was blinded by greed for a moment. Greed? Yes, even though I always pretended I didn't want to, deep down I really wanted to go to college and continue studying. So I decided to get married with the belief that it was possible. In simpler words, to use you on the way. Do you think I'll believe such a lie? Kyle scoffed coldly. But Leyla didn't seem to be shaken. It would be great if everything was a lie. A bitter smile stole over her trembling lips. For a small span of time, Leyla believed it was just sympathy or pity, but she soon got an understanding otherwise. Kyle Letman viewed Leyla Lewellin as a romantic partner. He proposed to her with the heart of a lover, but she accepted him with the heart of a friend. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. It was a pack of lies if she said that she was not greedy on the inside. It was precisely that fact which sank Layla's heart even deeper. I know you, Leyla. You're not that kind of person. Kyle leapt to his feet, his towering shadow looming over her. You love me. Do I look like an idiot who doesn't even know that? I love you, Leyla said. She made no denials. Is Kyle someone I love? Yes, she does love him. Leyla would nod her head repeatedly to answer that question. Even if she was asked 1,000 times, she was willing to nod every time with the same answer. As my best friend, as an older brother, or sometimes as a younger brother. I love you so much, Kyle. Leyla remained unflinching even as she beheld Kyle's growing hardened face. She had to. But I know this is not the kind of love you want. I'm sorry, Kyle, but I can't. I don't think I can love you like that. I cannot marry you with this kind of heart. I don't care. Kyle's throat cramped as he swallowed his spit. Whatever kind of love it is, as long as it is love, I don't care. It's okay even if it isn't the kind of love I'm looking for, Leyla. No. I don't want to do that. Leyla slowly lifted herself up. Their gazes were riveted between the howl of the forest wind. As she looked at the water that had been blown away by the wind, shaping small ripples on its surface, Leyla caught her breath. Not far from the cottage, this wooded creek was the playground for little Kyle and Leyla. Amidst her fear of water, she was able to dip her feet in the stream that barely reached her knees. Rather than the shelter river, Leyla enjoyed visiting this place more. She used to read her book on a boulder shaded by a tree, and Kyle would explore the brook, catching crayfish or small fish. He would collect lovely freshwater clams or pebbles, both of which were her favorites. They laughed a lot. Those were always fun and heartwarming moments. The time when she loved him was like that. There were so many pristine memories that were more glorious than playing in the water's ripples. But still, that time of love was irreplaceable. It would stay within her forevermore. Even so, I still have to lose you. I can't do it. I want to stop. Leyla dropped her head to hide her reddened eyes. I'm really sorry, Kyle. I should have told you from the beginning. If that's your only reason, don't even say that. This world is teeming with people who marry without love. Still, you love me. That's enough. Kyle approached her and wrapped her shoulders in his grip. You use me? Fine. Using me doesn't matter either. Don't be like this. As long as it's you, I'm fine. If I can be of any help, feel free to use me. Kyle, I'm alright as long as you don't desert me. Kyle's eyes began to flush. Leyla clenched her fists, attempting to fortify her wounded heart. I hate that. I don't want to do that. If you really want to go to college, if you're so desperate enough to use me, then you shouldn't let me go. Kyle, I want to marry someone I love as a man and a lover. The thought of marrying you and going to rats made me realize that. The vilest things she had been struggling to keep from saying eventually slipped out of her lips. Kyle's pupils dilated at her reply. I want to marry such a person and live without shame. My dream to feel that kind of love outweighs my ambition to attend college with you. Leyla, I had thought about using you, and pretending it was alright until the end, but then I felt like I would be ashamed of this choice for the rest of my life. I'm afraid I'll regret it. I'm not happy about living in a guilt fantasy. Leyla Lewellin. If I make such a choice, I fear it would taint my time and my heart, which loves you as a friend and a family member. I hate it the most and am scared of its occurrence. Her heartfelt voice was faintly shaking. When the time came for her to become a grown-up, she made the most childish decision she could imagine. Leyla ballooned her dream of attending college together for fear of losing him. But, in the end, this marriage turned out to be a genuine mistake that garnered her much regret. Mrs. Epman was entirely right. The moment she accepted Kyle's proposal, her relationship with him had already crossed the line of no return. Mrs. Epman's resentment towards her was too much for her to endure. Leyla couldn't separate Kyle from his beloved mother. Moreover, she didn't want Uncle Bill to get hurt. The trigger had already been pulled. The only thing that can be gained by revealing the truth would be a gash in everyone's heart. Leyla felt her body had been drained out of all the water after shedding so many tears, and there was no turning back at the end of the road. So she had to turn around at this point, in silence. It was the only way to save her last semblance of pride, Kyle's family, and Uncle Bill's heart. "Let me have that dream, Kyle," Leyla whispered as she looked at Kyle. Let's do that. So, let us bid farewell to those precious sparkling days and become adults." Leyla let out a quiet sigh against voicing what she intended to say. Her faintly heated breath flowed through her parched lips. "Don't cry." Tears didn't spring up in her eyes, fortunately. The spell she had learned along the way somehow had shown its worth. "Don't go." Kyle, who was standing still, grabbed Leyla by the wrist as she passed him. His big, hot hands were shaking. No answer. Leyla opened her tightly closed eyes and pushed his hand away. Kyle's hand fell off so easily. His grip on her wrists had lost its strength. Leyla walked away with weightless steps, leaving Kyle behind, who was standing stiffly staring at the stream. Her misty eye gleamed a shade of red, but they were held back until the moment she arrived at the cottage. Cry. Even better if you beg. Chapter 39. My beloved son. She's a smart girl, as expected. Mrs. Ettman felt a surge of relief washing over her as she saw her son's bedroom door snugly closed. After going out in the afternoon to meet Leyla a few days ago, Kyle returned home devastated like a bewitched person. Mrs. Ettman could foresee the ending of the two of them based on her son's condition, who was confined to his room with his lips clamped shut. "Madam, the young master skipped lunch today as well." With a worried face, the housekeeper reported to Mrs. Ettman, who had just come down from the second floor. "Leave him alone. He will also have a hard time swallowing food when having a breakdown." Mrs. Becker's eyes widened at Mrs. Ettman's unexpected response regarding her son. She seemed overjoyed, even though her son had skipped every meal since yesterday. But Mrs. Becker decided not to ask further, knowing that her milady would seldom reveal the actual reason, so she just bowed her head and walked away instead. Mrs. Ettman visited the garden after a long absence to tend to the flower bed. The garden at Ettman's house was brimming with exquisite and different kinds of roses which were imported from Arvis's shrubbery. She received several roses from Leyla von Herhardt, who exclusively gifted the flowers to her closest wives. She was the only woman without a title in Karlsbad who had fellowship with the two duchesses of the Herhardt household, and several people didn't know how proud she was of it. She believed that Kyle's marriage to the lower noble lady that was introduced by Norma von Herhardt would enhance the Ettman family's social standing. How hard she toiled to get here. Now her husband and son tried to thwart her efforts, only for the sake of one girl named Leyla. Linda Ettman readily admitted that she had done a great wrong towards that poor girl. But she had no regrets. For Kyle's sake, she could have performed far more gruesome acts than that. Leyla would be wise to seek a husband who was on par with her. Mrs. Ettman entered the living room, carrying a bouquet of roses that blended harmoniously in hues. She was delicately arranging the flowers in the vase when Dr. Ettman came in. "Kyle? Is he still doing that?" "Yes. Sounds like he went through a lot of trouble. I think something happened between him and Leyla." "I'm going to see Leyla." Mrs. Ettman spoke calmly as she centered the vase on the table. Did you forget? Kyle is my son as well." She smiled as she stood. "He is the son I love much more than you." Leyla was sitting in the corner of the yard washing a big pot when Mrs. Ettman visited her. Her appearance was soaked. The splashing jet of pump water drenched her apron, sleeves, and the crown of her head. "Hello, Mrs. Ettman." Leyla got up and greeted her without expressing surprise. "Please come." "No. You don't have to do that." Mrs. Ettman shook her head after thoroughly scrutinizing Leyla from head to toe and handing her the leather bag she had brought. Leyla could tell what was within without even looking at it. She came close to expressing her gratitude, as she always did after receiving something. But Leyla decided to swallow her words and accept the money bag quietly. Seeing Leyla shut her lips after receiving it, Mrs. Ettman furrowed her brow in annoyance. "Judging from the expression on your face, you seem to have a lot to say." "Yes." Leyla answered her without a grain of hesitation. She refused to bow her head, which she did the last time at the tea house. Mrs. Edmund erupted in laughter. Well, go ahead. I'll understand. She flashed a kind smile through her lips, which were stiff from the bitterness. Looks like you're done talking to Kyle. You already know, and that is why you returned our money, right? What did you say? Mrs. Edmund's eyes fluttered at Layla's bold tone, which contrasted markedly with her usual self. Don't worry, I made no mention of you. Worry? Yes. You appear worried that I will tell Kyle of what you really did that day. Huh. I had no idea you were such a daring child. My apologies if I sounded rude. I just wanted to tell you that Kyle doesn't know what happened that day. Layla bowed her head to express her apology. I didn't tell Kyle, she said. As her gaze returned to Mrs. Edmund again, her eyes grew fiercer. I won't ever tell him in the future as well. Even mentioning Kyle's name made Layla's heart ache. The memory of Kyle's back, which she had abandoned by the river that day, would forever change her life. It would undoubtedly stay as a pain inside that will last for the remaining of her days. I'm going to do it for Kyle, not for anyone else. For Kyle? Mrs. Edmund was snide, but Layla didn't seem to mind. Yes. I know. I know that Kyle loves his mother very much. Whatever you do to me, you are Kyle's precious mother. So I want to protect the mother he loves. I can't help but marvel how a brat like you has lived this long wearing the mask of a sweet and kind-faced child. I'm sorry if I offended you. Layla again dipped her head politely. Mrs. Edmund blanched in response to what she perceived to be a sign of ridicule. But, I meant that sincerely. I just wanted to let you know that you have nothing to worry about. It's a ballsy promise, so I'll try to believe it. Mrs. Edmund felt relieved but scrunched her eyes to disguise it. Since you said that you did it for Kyle, I'm hoping you'll explain to Kyle why you called off the wedding in a way that doesn't cause him undue pain. Yes. I will do that. Instead, Mrs. Edmund, come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Layla looked down at her money bag, then slowly lifted her gaze. I want you to apologize for one thing. What? Apologize? Yes. I can accept whatever you tell me, even if it's false, I will still accept it. But I want you to apologize for what you said about Uncle Bill. Layla raged. Her hand holding the bag became pallid, but she did not attempt to revert. You said that you hated Uncle Bill for bringing about such a tragedy into your life by raising me. Mrs. Edmund snorted as if she couldn't comprehend what she was saying. Again, Layla badgered her into apologizing. Please apologize for that. Her voice was soft yet insistent, born on the wind of a beautiful summer evening. Matthias's lips broke in a grin as he leaned against the wall, having to eavesdrop on their interesting conversation. He just finished swimming when he suddenly stepped foot towards the gardener's cottage while on his way back home, expecting to see Layla crying there. And Matthias had no regrets about making such a snap choice after witnessing a spectacle that was even more enthralling than her tears. He was eager to see what look Mrs. Edmund would put on her face, but Matthias decided to be patient, knowing that his entrance would merely bring their fascinating play to an end. Matthias took a seat on the window frame leaning against Layla's room window facing the backyard. He enjoyed watching the white pigeon pecking on its food as he awaited Linda Edmund's answer. What people say is true, one's roots cannot be deceived. After some silence, Linda Edmund's voice became strained with a maddening rush that she couldn't hide. Apologize? I'd rather feel sorry for Mr. Remmer, that poor man who reared a child like you. Linda Edmund, as one would expect. Pleased that his second prediction came true, Matthias petted the docile pigeon. He recalled seeing Layla's figure through the window of his car a few days ago. It was all still fresh in his mind. She sobbed piteously, and her body was soaked in a cold sweat. She had difficulty breathing properly, and her shaking body appeared scruffy. Very pathetic. Matthias gave a mocking smirk. His twitching lips gleamed in crimson red. If she has something to say, tell her, say it aloud. Don't you think so? After he gently spoke to the pigeon, Matthias left the cabin, dumping the drudgery spectacle behind. Then, he decided if Layla couldn't provide him with some fun, he would simply create his own. The hearsay started from Mrs. Mona. Have you guys heard? The reason why Leyla and Kyle broke up. Whenever she encountered the other employees of the duchy, Mrs. Mona would return in her furious tone to tell the marvelous story she had overheard previously. It was Mrs. Edmund who stole Layla's tuition from Mr. Remmer. The postman just told me. She sent someone else to steal their money. She wanted to make Leyla drop out of college and cancel her marriage with Kyle. Mrs. Mona held her breath momentarily as she spoke to add a dramatic effect, just like a popping firecracker. Everyone laughed in tandem. They were all blown away. Mrs. Mona was well known as a chatterbox. She eschewed idle gossip and never failed to give a solid grounding for every one of her storylines. I know. You can't believe it. Because I was like that too at first. However, the police had arrested the person who acted as Mrs. Edmund's lapdog in stealing the money. The postman, Mr. Berger, saw the thief in person when he was delivering the letter to the police station. He heard what had happened from the policeman. I bet you would all be shocked to know who he is. Mrs. Mona deliberately dropped her voice as she reached the story's most intriguing part. Do you all know Mr. Rayner? The businessman, who is also Mrs. Edmund's cousin. Oh, my God, he was the thief. What, Mr. Rayner? That Daniel Rayner? Yes. That Mr. Rayner. Mrs. Mona's tone grew more spiteful as they all noisily parroted the question in disbelief. And after she stole the money, Mrs. Edmund asked for a face-to-face meeting with Leyla. At some point she confronted her and said, "How dare you marry my son?" A stranger who happened to overhear their quarrel became suspicious and reported it to the police, which led to his arrest. Following that, the story rolled about like fireworks dotting upwards the night sky. Indeed, she was a wicked woman. How could she do such a cruel thing to that poor child? The stunned looks on her audience's faces grew wider when Mrs. Mona raised her voice as she struggled to suppress her emotions. I knew it. There is no way that Leyla would ever give up on college or marriage without doing anything. How could she have done such a horrible act? That noble Mrs. Edmund. The excited crowd flocked over to lend their voices. They all quickly developed into enthusiastic orators with the same veins as Mrs. Mona and began spreading the truth at the same speed. The word quickly traveled throughout Arvis's mansion, needing less than half a day, to be precise. It was late afternoon when Mrs. Mona, who seemed to have subdued her fury, saw Bill Remmer, who was calmly working in the garden. It seems the dim-witted guy still doesn't know. Regardless of how excited Mrs. Mona was about relaying the story, she was unhappy since this matter concerned someone close to her. But Bill Remmer is like Layla's father. He is someone who needs to know this better than anyone else. In her inner battle, Mrs. Mona made up her mind. Yes. I have to tell him. Finalizing her decision, she began waddling towards the garden. Cry. Even better if you beg. Chapter 40. Go back to my track. The uproar was pitched through the open windows and made its way into Kyle's ears beyond his tightly sealed bedroom door. Hey, Mrs. Edmund. Come out now. Right now. Kyle slowly raised his tired body. The man's thunderous yelling and wail-like voice was not a stranger to his ears. Uncle Bill? Kyle sprang out of his bed in surprise. He hastily walked to the window and witnessed a quarrel between Bill Remmer and a housekeeper at the front door. What kind of commotion is this? Mrs. Edmund appeared with a haughty yell. Mrs. Edmund, are you the damned thief? Is this an act that can be committed by someone who has been revered as a noble? No matter how much you hate Leyla, how could you do this? Kyle, who was rushing towards them to break up the brawl, suddenly stopped like a dead person in his tracks. Thief? Why did Uncle Bill mention the thief to my mother? Kyle stood frozen in a conundrum as Bill spewed forth an implausible, gruesome story in a fit of anger. His body suddenly became like a stiff board as he listened to those unbelievable utterances. No nonsense. How could he accuse my mother of such a heinous crime? Mumbling blankly, Kyle lurched out of the room. He made his way down the stairwell in stumbling steps. He couldn't take Uncle Bill's persecution towards his mother, no matter how angry he was about the theft incident. Did Leyla say that? Mrs. Edmund asked sharply after Bill stopped screaming. Good grief, how could she slander me like that? Does Leyla look like a child capable of telling such things? Bill shouted out in tears when Kyle was about to step out to the front door. If Leyla told me, My heart would not have been ripped asunder like this. If you want to create a scene by uttering nonsense, go back now. Before I call the police. Do you dare to call the police? Do you think you can bring the police when the postman saw your cousin being taken to the police station? What? Mrs. Edmund staggered. She took a step back. Please, Mother. Kyle prayed as he looked at his mother's back. Please say no, you're not the culprit. Say that it was just a slander. Mrs. Edmund kept mum, but her breathing was labored. Due to fear, her grip on the railing started to tremble. Kyle waddled towards his mother. Mother. Mrs. Edmund was stupefied. Only after hearing his pained voice, she noticed her son's presence standing behind her. That was not true, right? Kyle grabbed her arm. It was just a misunderstanding, right? Tell me. Kyle tried to laugh but failed. It was painfully obvious that this moment was real, yet a dense fog seemed to shroud his head. For him, the last couple of days were hellish. He visited, coaxed, and begged many times, but Leyla refused to change her mind. In his profound sadness, time was slipping away. Kyle had nonetheless pinned his big hopes. His father, who went to Rats, had already paid Layla's portion of the tuition. He believed everything would be fine as long as he could persuade Leyla and assure her. So he planned to visit Leyla this evening and cajole her once again. If marriage was too much of a burden, then how about an engagement? Let's go to college together while we're engaged. Engaged, that was enough for him. As time passed by, he believed that Layla's feelings would grow into that of a lover. Thus, they would live happily ever after. But now, Mother. Kyle gasped as his voice was stymied by tears. Mrs. Edmund froze and gazed down at the railing. Her face was pale and her lips were zipped tightly. That moment, Dr. Edmund arrived at the scene. He got out of the car alongside two police officers. Mrs. Edmund's legs buckled when she saw them and collapsed on the floor. Dr. Edmund begged the police to allow him to approach his wife alone. Strained expressions were plastered on his face. I'm really sorry, Mr. Remmer. He went towards Bill Remmer first and took off his hat. Even if I had 10 mouths, I have nothing to say. I'm sorry. Kyle's eyes welled up with despair as he watched his father apologizing repeatedly. As you can see, the situation is dire now, and it seems difficult to have a proper talk. Can I meet you and apologize again after things have calmed down? Let's do that. Bill Remmer furiously wiped his tears and nodded his head. As he stepped back, the officers came forward. Why did you do that, dear? Dr. Edmund's gaze fell coldly on her crouched wife. No. It's not what you think. Daniel is at the police station. He confessed everything. You bribed him. As soon as that name escaped from her husband's lips, Mrs. Edmund's lips clamped shut. She had nothing to say to defend herself. So don't try to lie to me, Linda. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks, dear. Are you going to pretend that you accept Leyla and do things like that in the future? You are not just my wife, but also Kyle's mother. Dr. Edmund eventually lost his temper. An uncontrollable surge of fury he couldn't suppress anymore distorted his face. It's all your fault. Mrs. Edmund lashed out irately as she cried. Why? Why the hell did you allow Leyla to wreak destruction on my life? What kind of rubbish are you spewing now that you've committed such a crime? No. It was all your fault. As I had already said, I disliked her from the beginning. I would not have come this far if you had just listened to me back then. If it was not for you, A loud sob escaped her mouth, and the hands covering her face soon became doused with tears. With a sigh, Dr. Edmund roused his sobbing wife. The officers showed their respect for the notable doctor by letting him bring his wife inside the car. Kyle stood motionless, watching the nightmarish scene with his eyes wide open. Before long, a thick layer of dusk began to cloak the blue yonder, and he had not yet awoken from that hellish dream. Kyle shut his eyes in the dazzling dusk of the twilight. He wished the entire world would be buried in a blanket of darkness. It was his only hope at the moment. Uncle, please don't cry. Leyla gently placed her handkerchief on the table. Bill, who had been staring at his beer glass sternly as if it was his enemy, lifted his head in bewilderment. Crying? Who is crying? Although he vehemently denied it, Bill wiped the wet corners of his eyes with Layla's handkerchief. His untouched food had cooled on the plate, but no one was urging him to have the meal. Both Bill and Leyla were mindful, they couldn't eat. While Bill gulped and emptied his glass, Leyla leaned her gaze at the table's edge. Her face looked drained. Leyla was unaware of what had occurred until she heard the words of comfort from Arvis employees, who came to the cottage. Mrs. Etman was unlikely to divulge the incident on her own, and she also kept her mouth sealed. Nevertheless, everything about that day was eventually disclosed. Leyla had no clue who had informed the police about their private talks. That day, the old tea shop on the outskirts of town had no other visitor except for her, Mrs. Etman, and a stranger. Who leaked the rumors then? Who the hell is he? Leyla could not even make a hazy guesstimate, no matter how hard she thought about it. Whatever the case, one thing's for sure, she had inflicted an irreversible wound on Kyle. She had broken his heart, which she wanted to protect. Mrs. Etman was taken to the police station by several officers accompanied by Dr. Etman. And Kyle was there witnessing it all. Leyla, don't cry. Bill put down his glass and handed a handkerchief to her. Crying? Who's crying? As Bill did a while ago, Leyla stubbornly denied and wiped the corners of her reddened eyes. Sorry. I don't know about the world out there, but I encouraged and pushed you till you suffered painful things like this. If you say that, Uncle, you're going to make me upset. Marriages? Yes. I'd rather not let you marry. Right, it's better like this. Leyla stayed quiet, but she nodded her head deeply. Her lips glistened faintly as she smiled, dampened by her tears. But, I want you to attend college, Leyla. Dr. Etman had already paid for your tuition, and returning the money to them is the same as me paying for your tuition. College has nothing to do with Kyle. No. If you need something like a house or boarding house, I'll give you more money. My finances might be a bit tight, but don't worry, I'll work harder to cover all of your living costs. Uncle, I will go to college, said Leyla. I am not giving up. But, not now. She reached out and held Bill's hand. I'm going to be a teacher. She added. I'm going to save money and retake the exam once I'm able to afford to study in the capital. That was my original goal and dream. It was just that the shortcut blinded me for a while, but now I'm back on my track. But you can't just give up after what you've been through. You have already been accepted into college. Don't you believe me? Leyla smiled peacefully. Even if I take the exam again, I believe I will still pass it. At that time, I will be accepted with a higher grade to qualify for the scholarship. You will see. Leyla, my dear. Uncle, didn't you tell me? I'll become a good adult. So please trust me one more time. This good child, what should I do with her? Bill opined that it would have been better if she had cried, rather. Leyla laughed merrily. She seemed to have no idea that her smile had ripped a hole in Bill Remmer's heart. And Kyle, what should I do with you? Bill's shoulders began to shake as he couldn't control his overwhelming mixed feelings. He hurriedly dropped his head, not wanting to show his pitiful state. His thick, hot tears streamed down his face and dropped over the table. It's okay, Uncle. Leyla rose from her chair and approached him. I'm really fine. She hugged him with her petite arms. Really? I don't want to punish Mrs. Etman. It's fine now that we've got our money back. Leyla comforted him with a gentle voice and patted him on the back. What should I do with you? Tears threatened to spill from his eyes as his hard strangled words seared from his throat. Bill nodded as he wiped away the tears. He judged what she did to be unpardonable. Bill, however, felt uneasy the whole time after he saw Mrs. Etman collapsing in front of him and Kyle looking so pale. Linda Etman was Kyle's mother, regardless of how wicked she was. To Leyla, she was like a second mother, as she was the mother of Layla's precious Kyle. Let's do that. If that's how you feel, then I'm fine, Leyla. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 41. How to let go of beautiful blues. What a louche story. Duchess Norma gave a short yet bitterly cold riposte when Mrs. Etman's story was brought up at the dinner table. I can't believe her, the wife of such a prestigious doctor's family, was arrested for stealing. I'm curious as to what kind of nonsense this is." After taking a sip of wine, she wiped her lips together in disgust at the vulgar story. "I have to wrap up my relationship with Mrs. Edman." Leyla von Herhardt responded similarly to her mother-in-law. Linda Edman was locked at the police station yesterday night and just got released this noon after Bill and Leyla visited the station, stating they didn't want to prolong the case since they had already got their money back. "It's a shame that Dr. Edman was greatly disgraced by this event. He's a good person. But should we change our doctor? Since it's not Dr. Edman's fault, I suppose we don't need to. This kind of scandal will quieten down after a while." Duchess Norma resolutely voiced her unwavering faith in Dr. Edman. "I hope Kyle doesn't get hurt by this." She showed some sympathy while speaking about Kyle Edman. "Now that things have turned into such a mess, I regret allowing the child to stay at Arvis." Leyla von Herhardt blurted out at the end of her meal. "Leyla created this whole situation." She looked at Claudine as if seeking an accord. "Right, I think so too." Claudine gladly nodded her head. "Although unintentionally, Leyla has ruined the Edmans household." As she said it firmly, Claudine glanced across the table. Although he was a soft-spoken guy by nature, Matthias was unusually quiet during dinner tonight. Nevertheless, he showed no signs of being strange, rather he seemed to be as gentle as ever. Like the dinner that came to an end, the scandal that had ensnared Arvis Manor would soon be forgotten. Matthias went right to his bedroom instead of going to his study. He had instructed Hessen to send the spy who tailed Linda Edman to the police station that day. Matthias wanted him to testify against the theft when the postman was scheduled to deliver the documents to the station. Given the postman's closeness to Arvis's employees, he expected the rumors were sure to spread like wildfire. Everything went smoothly according to his plan. And the Arvis's chef, a well-known newsmonger, played the last key part in helping the postman with his whistleblower tasks. It was a cliché ending, but Matthias had great fun. Did Linda Edman cry? Matthias's thoughts rummaged for that idea as he turned on the lamp near the window. Probably she did, like Leyla. That simple climax added another layer of excitement to his stage play. The marriage of Leyla Lewellin and Kyle Edman had now crossed the line of no return. Even if there was such a thing as love, their marriage has undoubtedly been ruled out. To keep it short, Leyla Lewellin had forfeited whatever luck she may have had. Matthias left the window and sauntered to the drinks cabinet. All of the beverages stored there were still unopened as he wasn't fond of alcohol. He took out the bottle of wine closest to him and poured the clear amber-colored liquor into his crystal glass. Leyla's wings had been cut off. Matthias pondered calmly as he turned around, with a glass of wine in his hand. "So Leyla will stay inside the cage called Arvis." His satisfaction at knowing this fact had outweighed his rude awakening. Matthias spent a long time staring at his sleeping canary, snoozing in her comfy cage. His gaze then wandered to the garden outside the window before returning to the golden liquor in his hand. His mood right now wasn't as bad as the one he had on the late spring night when he heard of Leyla's upcoming marriage to the doctor's son. That night was terrible as he remembered when the desire to kill someone took over his head for the first time in his life. Leyla and Kyle's love story had a better ending than the death of a person. Matthias put the drink he hadn't sipped on the table quietly. Even without having to borrow the effects of liquor, he was already aware of the way to erase the lump in his heart and his beautiful blues. He just needed to own her. The case of stolen tuition, which made Arvis Manor fall into a buzz, came to an end at the peak of summer. The matter was flawlessly settled, with Bill Remmer getting his money and Mrs. Edman avoiding punishment thanks to his goodwill. Even so, it wasn't enough to eradicate the consequences in her ruined afterimage from the public's mind. Dr. Edman slowly opened the door of his son's room, who didn't respond to his knocking. Kyle was sitting quietly in front of the desk. He kept looking out the window even though his father approached him. "Kyle." Dr. Edman called out his name for the second time and tapped him on the shoulder. Surprised, Kyle turned around. His face was worn to a frazzle. Dr. Edman slid his hand away from Kyle's shoulder and leaned on the edge of his desk. "Your mother is a little better now," he said. "Yes," Kyle answered tersely. "Come and read on our website Wuxia World site." "Thanks." Mrs. Edman, who was bedridden from shock after being taken to the police station, drank and ate almost nothing. He was worried as his mother had been suffering from a high fever for several days, but fortunately, her illness had not worsened to a critical stage. "I've been looking for a house for you to stay in, Rats," Dr. Edmund calmly informed him, and Kyle looked stumped. "What do you mean by house?" "It's a house that's suitable for living alone, and it's furnished." "Am I going to college alone?" Kyle asked with a peal of scornful laughter. "Without Leyla? After I heard her like that? Am I going to college alone as if nothing happened?" "I understand how you feel, Kyle, but your stubbornness on this matter will only hurt Leyla more." "Father, let's accept it, Kyle, that your relationship with Leyla is over. This is the best option for you and Leyla, and also for everyone else. Both of you must live your own lives." Dr. Edmund sounded firm, even bordering on cold, ignoring Kyle's heartbreaking gaze. The situation itself was suffocating for his son, but precisely for that reason, he needed to address his son level-headedly. Nothing mattered more than protecting Kyle. He believed that Kyle's wounds would gradually fade away after leaving Carlsbad, distancing himself from Leyla, and getting acquainted with a new environment at the university. That was the sole hope Dr. Edmund could have for the time being. "Your mother was at fault, but it doesn't relieve us of responsibility either. We chose to overlook the fact that your mother's heart could never accept Leyla. You and I, we were the ones who drove her into that corner. Because Leyla is an orphan and doesn't have a glamorous background, she cannot satisfy mother's snobbery. That was why mother can't accept her? Is that what you meant?" "Kyle, enough. Even if she's wrong, it's unacceptable to talk badly about your mother." "I don't know anymore. Is she my mother that I've known and loved for so long? And I don't know why I have to go to college." "Are you going to give up your life because of your failed first love?" "Leyla. Do you think she only means that much to me?" "If that's not the case, you should strive to be more level-headed. The more you act like an idiot, the more painful it gets for Leyla." "But I'm unable to go alone without her." "You and Leyla are now past hope." "No." Kyle howled. "There must be a way. Somehow. If I beg, if I apologize, if I convince her otherwise." "Wake up, Kyle Edmund. Don't you already know that's impossible?" Dr. Edmund violently quaked his son's shoulder, his voice rose. Kyle shook his head in denial. He yanked his father's hand from his shoulder and fled from the room. Dr. Edmund, who knew where he was going, decided not to chase after him. Even if it hurts him, he believed that Kyle had to face reality beyond his hope. The weather today was sweltering, but Leyla's attire was orderly groomed, bordering on stuffy. Her blouse's collar was neatly ironed, the buttons clicked to the neck, and her skirt was faultless, without even a single pleat. Not to mention the pantyhose that cocooned her slender legs. Her appearance didn't seem to be unkempt at the slightest. Even the afternoon sun was diligently bathing the road in its scorching heat. Her cheeks were flushed crimson and out of breath due to the heat. However, Leyla walked gallantly, keeping her posture upright even after reaching a deserted street devoid of people. Leyla Lewellin these days earned sympathy from everyone wherever she went. People openly consoled her and spoke ill of Mrs. Edmund. They kicked their tongue in the spleen, and few shed tears after hearing her heart-wrenching story. Similarly, today was no exception. The teacher at Gillis Girls High School, whom Leyla met when seeking a teaching job, was the first person to express her pity with a heavy sigh. "Indeed, Leyla. You have to cheer up and think realistically for the solution. It's sad, but what else can you do? Everything had already happened." She grabbed Leyla's hand and said words of comfort repeatedly. Likewise, the familiar faces she encountered in the city did the same. Her gratitude for them was tempered with some shame. Leyla was at a loss for words and just greeted them cordially with a faint smile on her face. Every time she did, Leyla tried not to assume things about the vague smiles that flickered on people's lips. It was fortunate that she didn't have to dwell on anything else since she was too busy maintaining her straight grin mask. "I wish I could cut you off some slack, But this is the best thing I could do right now. Gillis's teacher gave a sighing answer after consoling Leyla for a long time. All teaching positions at Carlsbad Primary School had already been occupied. Her last remaining option was to work in a small town about an hour away by train. Leyla eventually accepted the job after much deliberation. Given that commuting would be too exhausting, she needed to find a boarding house near the school. However, she would be able to return to Arvis on weekends. Perhaps after a year of teaching there, she would be offered the opportunity to relocate to a school in Carlsbad. Leyla took off her hat for a moment to recover her breath after arriving in front of the Arvis estate's magnificent gateway. She had a harder time dealing with Uncle Bill than anyone else. Uncle Bill always gave her a somber gaze whenever she smiled in front of him. Hence, she couldn't shed a tear in his presence. "Well, this is good news, so I suppose it's fine." Leyla strode along the path in a blue funk. Even if it didn't mean like she would be saying goodbye to Uncle Bill for good, she felt upset whenever she thought about attending a school that was too far away from home. As she walked, Leyla tried to make her smile a little brighter. She made her way to the garden, eager to tell Uncle Bill the news as quickly as possible. The moment she passed under the arching arbor of the rose garden, Kyle was already standing there, waiting for her. "Kyle?" Layla's pupils dilated. Kyle rushed up to her as if he were being chased by something and grabbed her wrist. He seemed to be a completely different person right now. "Let's go, Leyla." "Go where?" "Let go of my hand first and then we can talk." "Let's run away from here, just the two of us." Kyle's grip, holding Layla's wrist, grew stronger. Cry. Even better if you beg. Chapter 42. Nowhere in this world. Leyla stood gawking. Her eyes shook the moment she stared at Kyle's peaky face with his tousled hair and wrinkly clothes. "Don't be like this, Kyle. Where now?" "Let's go anywhere. Let's go somewhere where just the two of us can become happy." "Let's do that." Kyle harshly grabbed her hand and dragged her while mumbling like a lost person, closing his ears. Layla's fierce resistance only made Kyle widen his stride ahead without budging. "Mr. Remmer. Mr. Remmer. Look over there. Leyla is being dragged away." A gardener who happened to be nearby witnessed the scene and exclaimed. Bill shifted his gaze to the direction he pointed at. Straightway, his face heated up. Bill threw his pruning shears and frantically chased after Kyle. The baffled employees in tandem quickly joined the bandwagon. "Kyle Edman. Let go of her hand right now," Bill shouted, as anger rose to the crown of his head, struck a chord like thunder. He slammed a punch in Kyle's face without delay. Kyle slumped and fell, but he dared not release his grip on Layla's wrist. In the gusts of wind, Layla's body also hit the dirt of the rose bed. "Leyla!" Bill screamed in shock and hurried to assist Leyla in getting up. She had scratches on both of her cheeks and the back of her hands from thorny roses. Kyle's spaced-out eyes began to gradually regain their focus. He got to his feet, ghastly-faced, after seeing Layla's face smeared with blood in his sightline. "Leyla. Are you okay?" "Blood." "I'm fine." Leyla pushed Kyle's hand away from her face. "You look more hurt." "No. I'm not." Kyle then looked at his shirt and bleeding hands. He felt a throbbing pain in his cheek and the back of his neck, but he ignored it. "Uncle. Don't worry, I'm fine." Leyla hurried to stop Bill before he approached Kyle again. "Kyle," she carefully spoke. Her swollen, glassy eyes captured his face. "There is no such place." Layla's smiling lips quivered slightly at the corners. Her soothing tone of voice concealed her crimson eyes and heated cheeks. "There is no such place in the world, Kyle. There's nowhere in this world where just the two of us can be happy." "Leyla, it's too hard for me if you insist like this. I don't know how much longer I can stand it." "Please, Leyla." "So take care of yourself. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine too." "How could I be fine without you?" "Go to college as planned, study hard, and stay healthy. Then, become a good doctor." Leyla gave Kyle's wounded eyes a good stare. Bitter tears that trickled down her cheeks had glistened her face in sadness. "My Kyle. My good friend, Kyle Edman. I want to see you in that light." A single drop of grief welled up from the corner of his eyes. Kyle swallowed the sobbing with his teeth gritted and stared at her with reddened eyes. If you're doing well, I will be fine too. We might be able to greet each other with a smile as time passes by. Sorry. I'm sorry, Leyla. Kyle's gut-wrenching sobs that tore apart his chest escaped from between his lips. It was all my fault. Because of me, you. I'm so sorry. The sun's piercing light descended on him like shards of broken glass. Kyle collapsed to his knees like crushed rose petals strewn over the ground. Leyla shook her head and crouched before him. No, Kyle. Don't say that. I don't resent you. How can I hate you? Leyla. So, take care. You will, right? Kyle gasped as if he was being strangled and hugged her tightly. His dread erupted in a torrent of uncontrolled sobs. Blood and tears dripping from his wounds marred Layla's white blouse. Bill let out a long sigh. He withdrew his gaze, unable to bear the sight of the two youngsters hugging. The workers a few feet away also did the same. With resentful eyes, Bill glanced at the sun blazing down on him in the blistering heat. He longed more than ever for this bitter summer to elapse ere long. Kyle Ettman left for the capital sooner than scheduled. The Ettman household put forward a flimsy reason that they had to prepare for college entrance, but no one believed it. On the morning of Kyle's departure, Leyla woke up earlier than usual. Cuckoo. A bird chirping could be heard from the outside. Leyla turned her head to follow the cries and saw Phoebe sitting on her window ledge. She put her glasses on, ambled up to the window and flung it open. The bird's ankle was tied along with a scrap of paper. Phoebe was trained as a homing pigeon to fly between her window and Kyle's room. Leyla didn't have to candle who the letter was addressed to. She hesitated a while before carefully opening the letter. Leyla, I'm leaving for the capital today. I'm traveling to where I was supposed to go with you. But like a coward I'm leaving alone. I won't say this is better for us by telling you a plausible lie. Eventually, I'm running away. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. I'm turning a blind eye to the messed up reality and leaving you behind. I lack the courage to assure you that everything is fine. I'm sorry. I know very well that my apology can't wash away your wounds. Still, I want to convey these words. I'm sorry for all the pains my mother foisted on you and for my inability to stop her. I was too naive to think that everything could be sorted easily. Deaf to your feelings, I ended up hurting you. I'm sorry, I realized my mistake. But Leyla, I'll be back. I won't be too late. I'll make sure to return to you soon. You may be right when you said that there's nowhere in this world where only the two of us can be happy. But Leyla, if there is no such place, I'll ensure that I create one on my own. And I'll bring you there. Until that day, I will be doing good, just like you've asked of me. So take care of yourself too. My beloved Leyla, goodbye. Leyla read through Kyle's handwritten letter slowly. The dawning wind ruffled her bushy blonde hair, which draped politely over her cheeks. After a long pause, Leyla turned away from the window. She stowed the letter inside her desk drawer and hurriedly started her morning rounds. It was an insanely hectic day. Leyla meticulously cleaned the entire house as if a single speck of dust wouldn't be tolerated to stay on the surface of any place. Her kitchen was brimming with delectable food that she had cooked herself. Before long, Bill returned to work after lunchtime, and a couple of Arvis workers who were close to them came to the cottage. Leyla, are you all right? Mrs. Mona worriedly asked as she handed out a basket full of luscious cookies and pastries. Yes, I'm fine. Leyla flashed a smile and gladly embraced the gift. Thank you, ma'am. Kindly go in and have a cup of tea. Tea? Oh. There's no need to bother really. Mrs. Mona shook her head. Other co-workers nodded in tandem with her. That's right. We just wanted to know whether you're fine. Yes, Leyla, don't be sad. First love doesn't always come true. I'm sure you'll find a better man than Kyle. Hey, it's almost time. Let's go back soon. I have to prepare for the Duchess' tea time. Mrs. Mona swiftly cut her off as she glared at the maid whose words were about to cross the line. Leyla saw them off and went back to the kitchen with a heavy basket. She carefully took out the cookies and cakes from the basket one by one and arranged them nicely on the table. Suddenly her hand stopped. She momentarily froze upon seeing a toasted cracker with a peach jam filling. It was Kyle's favorite cake. Leyla vacantly looked across the table to the chair where Kyle was usually seated. The day when the three of them dined together at this table would never return. That lone chair evoked pleasant memories in her thoughts. The time of their delicious good feasts, warm dim lights and loud chatter on the table. All of it had now gradually perished into a gulf of silence. Leyla blinked and rushed to tidy up the basket before leaving the cottage. She grabbed her well-used sling bag and the hat hanging in front of the rear door and made her way to the forest trail. Fennel. Yorkshire fog. Buddleia. Katydid. Green linnet. Swallowtail. Leyla went along the path, whispering the names of the flowers that were blooming. The clinking sound of the stuff in her bag chimed along with the mumbled names of Mother Earth as a cradle song. After a long trek, Leyla stopped at the foot of an idyllic tree standing on the banks of the Shelter River. She immediately began climbing it to the summit and perched between the thick branches of the wooden trunks. Leyla stared at the bend of the blue Shelter River through her empty gaze. The sparkles of the water scales made her eyes feel cold. "As you said, Master, it has been handled well." Hessen, who turned back after a short phone call, said. Matthias gave the nod as he had grasped the meaning of the word without the butler's explanation. His gaze remained patched on the river beyond the colossal window. "They will notify us by telegram today." After concluding the report, Hessen moved on to the next agenda, the dinner scheduled for the following week and the guest list. The visit of Count Brandt. The issue of workforce expansion. Daily reports and Matthias' pithy answers were sequentially layered on top of one another. "Then sir, I'll take my leave now." Hessen left the annex after everything was done. Once alone, Matthias descended the stairs connecting to the bottom floor. The pavilion was built in the shape of a floating house on stilts. Half of the ground level was devoted to a boat hangar, designed to be openly attached to the river. Matthias could simply cross the river anytime he pleased by untying their ropes and rowing over. Matthias stripped off his clothes on the hangar's floor and dived into the water. As he swam across the arched foyer, the dazzling sun soon devoured his nude body bathed under its light. Matthias let the gentle stream of the river cling to his flesh. Through his flexible stroke, he looked like a part of the river at first glance. The lingering attachment that he couldn't have was bound to grow into a bigger and tougher desire beyond his control, even if he believed he would soon become tired of it once he had it. And Leyla was no exception. Breathing hard, Matthias reached that conclusion. He felt silly for getting carried away by the ephemeral hankering. Still, he graciously accepted the desire to have her. And now, nothing could stand in his way. He was free to do anything he pleased. The male lead who failed to protect their puppy love had eventually left, and Leyla was abandoned in the forest at the end of their fairy tale. Everything in his world had been back to its proper place, in a perfect line, just as he wished. By the time he turned around and began swimming back to the annex, the slanting rays of the setting sun had tinted the sky a warm orange. Matthias' eyes narrowed at the river's edge when he saw the familiar, beautiful tree. Ridiculously, there was a woman present, where he casually cast his gaze. Leyla Lewellin. He chanted her name silently like a spell, sending ripples over the water's surface. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 43. Beautiful song. After swimming back to the hangar, Matthias changed his clothes and left the annex. The sky was darkening as the sunset descended from its zenith. But Leyla was still there, crying on top of the tree, oblivious of his arrival. Matthias eased to his feet under the tree. The hose wasn't long before Leyla turned her head and looked at him from the top. She didn't seem surprised, nor did she try to escape his gaze. She also exhibited no signs of fear or worry either. Why? Matthias soon found the reason. She wasn't exactly looking at him. Her dim eyes seemed to wander somewhere far away, probably toward the place where the doctor's son had left. By the time Matthias slanted his lips, Layla's eyes had returned to focus. Her green eyes soon filled with a sense of shame. Her shoulders sucked in, and her face became stiff. She was back to the Leyla Lewellin that he knew. Matthias casually peered at her teary eyes with his arms folded. He had a leisurely evening and wasn't bound by any schedule, so Matthias had plenty of time to wait for her to stop weeping. He saw Layla's eyes flashed with contempt when he had no intention of leaving, but her scathing arrogance only made him giggle. "You know, Leyla, that boy is not coming." Matthias took a step closer to the tree in which she was sitting. "Kyle, the boy you're waiting for. Ah. Should I now call him the one who left you?" His lips smiled up at her. His tone was gentle and calm, though the sting in his words hadn't dimmed in the slightest. Leyla teared up at hearing those words. The twilight sky above her revealed itself, devoid of the birds that had returned to their nests. Her vision of the gradually swelling landscape soon turned into steamy tears and flowed down her cheeks. Leyla bit her lower lip. She kept silent until the darkness slowly snuffed out her surroundings. She patiently awaited his leave, but the wicked Duke was still standing beneath the tree. So Leyla decided to climb down the back of the tree, which was unreachable from his sight. Her head was slightly dizzy from all the crying. It's fortunate that she didn't stumble and was able to step on the ground safely. Leaning against the tree, Leyla wiped her tear-stained face with her apron. She spruced up her tangled hair and straightened her posture. Only after that, she looked back, and the Duke was still blocking the path to the cottage. After building up some nerve, Leyla approached him one step at a time. She couldn't care less about her scruffy face as her untamed tears were still sticking on it. As she couldn't keep her tears hidden, Leyla chose to show it off with confidence. This time she was determined to never again be his plaything. "I apologize for my disrespect. Goodbye then, Duke." Leyla bowed her back with the greatest politeness from a distance of 2 steps away. At this point, giving the nobility the courtesy they wanted, has become as easy to her as breathing. "Leyla." Matthias called out her name the moment she was about to pass by him. Leyla flinched, but her stride went undisturbed. "Leyla Lewellin." Matthias laughed and turned. But Leyla ignored him and continued ahead as if she were deaf. His brows wrinkled into a scowl at her rudeness that had crossed the line. He was about to stop her when Leyla suddenly collapsed. "Arg." She sat slumped on the ground, unable to get up. Her tiny hunched shoulders and frail back trembled intermittently. Matthias scoffed and slowly approached her. Leyla Lewellin, the upright girl whose eyes never lost their boldness despite her tears, was now wailing terribly after taking her nasty fall. Matthias squatted in front of her, bending one knee, and picked up her dropped glasses. Still, Leyla didn't raise her head. The tears that had always entertained him this time no longer did. Matthias now learned what to name this feeling after seeing her crying over the boy named Kyle. Hate. A feeling of emotion he never had. "Don't cry." Matthias grabbed her chin. Leyla tried to dodge but was unable to escape his grip. "Let me go." "Don't cry." Matthias overlooked her protests and repeated his demand. With just one hand, he was able to tame her fully. "Shouldn't you be happy to see me cry?" Leyla threw a flout at him. The dewdrops in her eyes became thicker and hotter as she endured his grip's humiliation. "Since when did you take an interest in my pleasure?" Matthias sneered at her, who sniffled frantically in front of his nose. "Why? You don't like me having fun?" "No." Leyla shook her gripped face, stubbornly trying to contain her sobs. "Whether or not the Duke likes it, it has nothing to do with me. My tears are not related to you." "What is that, Leyla?" Matthias tilted his head. "It does have something to do with me. So, don't cry." Over again. Matthias's gentle look held her a moment longer. Leyla was stunned, and she groused. "Do I need your permission to cry?" "Perhaps." "Why should I?" "You have no right to do so." "I have no right?" "You don't own me just because you're the owner of Arvis." "Really?" After a quick frown, Matthias' face soon lit up with excitement. "Then, shall I have you now?" "Come and read on our website, Wuxia World site." "Thanks." Emotion fled his face when his smile disappeared. Leyla cowered at the sight of the face that reminded her of the water's still, windless surface. "So that I can be your owner." Matthias fondled her lips with the tip of his finger. Leyla shuddered with dread when his touch rekindled the memories of her odious last summer. Her burning heart, which had been aflutter in sorrow at losing Kyle, seemed to freeze suddenly. "And no, I don't want to." Leyla heaved her body with all her might. She was sick to her core at the sight of herself groveling at his feet. Matthias then let her go, much like a child who had become bored with his toy and threw it away. Matthias rose first and stood there watching her crawl to her feet under his shadow. Soil dust and tears marred her shape, but not her eyes. The flame had not yet burned out in her irises. "Duke, I really don't understand you. You already have a fiancé, but you always do such inexplicable acts. I hate all of this." "So what?" Matthias asked back, fiddling with her loose glasses. "What does your heart have to do with me?" His tone was devoid of hostility. "I just want to have you." He wanted it, then he had it. His principle was that simple. Matthias von Herhardt wanted Leyla Lewellin. He wanted her, and he would have her. He believed something could be thrown away only after having that something. And he had to leave her after he had her so that his life would be complete again. Matthias gently put the glasses on Leyla's dejected face. "Go on." He released his hand, and Leyla lost her balance and fell back on the spot. Matthias stood peering down on her for a while before he left the riverside to continue his stroll. Leyla stayed there alone for a long time, even after he was no longer seen. "Leyla. Leyla. Come here and look at this." Bill Remmer greeted Leyla excitedly after she returned to the cabin. Leyla approached Bill merrily as he sat on the porch. She knew she couldn't deceive her uncle with such a sloppy laugh, but she didn't want to show him her stupid weeping face. "What's going on, Uncle?" "A telegram arrived. It's for you." "Telegram?" Leyla was puzzled when Bill gave her the telegram. It was a letter of notice about job openings for teaching positions at a rural school not far from Arvis estate. Beginning from the next semester, she would be able to work at the school rather than commute to a neighboring city. "It's weird. They said that there were no more openings at Carlsbad." The good news left her confused. Bill raised his hands and softly patted her head. "It's so hard for me to send you far away, Leyla. But I'm glad this kind of luck came in." Looking at Bill's relief-filled gaze, Leyla giggled as she nodded. She could come every weekend to visit her beloved uncle despite her work in a nearby city. However, her heart was uneasy whenever she left Uncle Bill at the cottage alone. But Leyla was unable to savor her bliss once the Duke's visage loomed in her thoughts. She was grateful she didn't have to part from Uncle Bill. But on the other hand, she loathed living under the same roof as the Duke. What a stupid thought. "Leyla, what's wrong?" Bill seemed worried, and Leyla realized her face appeared glum. "No. It's nothing." A rim of brilliant moonlight shone over her smiling face. "It's like a fluke, so I'm a bit shocked." "Really?" "Yes." She twinkled, and her smile lit up a little more. "Uncle, aren't you hungry? Let's have a nice dinner." The draping curtains in the bedroom, which partially obscured the open window, swelled up in the night air before repeatedly sinking. Inside the room, the tinkling piano tune played the transition of a music piece. The tapping chords flowed mellifluously, creating an extremely delicate and flashy symphony yet, to some extent, sounding depressed. Matthias reclined on a chair near the window, tin scissors and a handkerchief in his hands. When he clicked his finger, the canary swooped down and perched on his hand. He learned that canaries, like people, could improve their singing by being trained often. His lips rose into a smile when the bird was humming in tune with the piano being played. The canary wiggled its little body covered in soft feathers and cocked its head as if in deep study. Matthias gently wrapped the bird with the handkerchief he had brought after the singing had stopped. Knowing that the bird would be frightened of the person who cut its wings, the zookeeper always covered the bird's eyes before trimming their wings. After entrusting the job to the zookeeper for so long, Matthias could now easily trim its overgrown feathers. The first few times he cut its wing too short, the bird bled. It wasn't severely injured, but seeing its golden wings splattered with blood wasn't a pleasant sight. Matthias disliked it, so he grew more circumspect. Matthias skillfully spread out and clasped the branches of the bird that trusted him. He grabbed the scissors from his lap after deciding which feathers were to be clipped. Strand by strand, the feathers were strewn along the slashed area. The plumages fluttered in accord and fell on his perfectly polished shoes. Matthias then rolled up the handkerchief that had been shielding the bird's eyes after he had done cutting off the last wings. The canary flapped its wings several times before sitting on his finger. As if nothing had happened, the canary began to sing again. It was a beautiful song. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 44. The first autumn. Oh my goddess. Leyla. What are you doing up there? A high-pitched screech from below the tree nearly made Leyla drop her half-bitten apple. She snatched the fruit before it fell. Mrs. Mona appeared in her sight as she lowered her gaze. She was glaring at Leyla with her arms firmly crossed. Hello, Mrs. Mona. Isn't the weather really nice today? After a simple greeting, Leyla hurriedly stuffed the apples and books into her bag. Mrs. Mona's brow knitted as she watched Leyla fluidly glide down the tree trunk. At the same time, Bill Remmer returned to the cottage. It's all because of you, Mr. Remmer. Mrs. Mona growled at Bill Remmer moments after he ditched his cart. I warned you to raise her like a modest lady. I've advised you many times, with my experience of raising 3 daughters, and yet you consistently ignore what I say. Take a look at her now. A grown lady and a teacher who's supposed to educate children, climbed a tree like that. Is there a rule that school teachers can't climb trees? A good teacher should be capable of doing everything. Bewildered by the matter, Bill raised his voice and was ready to debate her. Ever since Leyla's stay in Arvis, the pair's parenting styles had never been in agreement. Leyla wanted to say that she was now a grown-up. Instead, she wittily approached her uncle. Look at her. It's all your fault. You should have gotten rid of her bad tomboy habits by at least spanking her ass when she was a child. Mrs. Mona's ghoulish grumble made Leyla gasp and impulsively caressed her bottom. Bill and Leyla both had their feet freeze in place, as if they were being punished for making a mistake. After a few minutes of nagging, Mrs. Mona suddenly remembered her original reason for being there and handed a basket of food to them before leaving. Bill and Leyla met eyes and exchanged guffaws. I feel like her scold has smacked me in the butt. I can't handle this anymore, Leyla. You'll have to climb trees secretly from now on. Don't get caught by her. I'm afraid I'll become deaf if I hear her blaring voice. Okay, uncle, I'll do that for you. After nodding, Leyla picked up the heavy basket and sauntered into the home. The old sling bag on her shoulder shook, making a clattering sound as it moved in time with her steps. Anyway, that junk bag needs to be burned soon. Bill tutted as he gazed at the crap bag, which she refused to throw away. His worries didn't seem to have a bearing on Leyla's everyday life. She lived gallantly. After the new school semester started, she began teaching the children as a new primary school teacher. She was sometimes careless and couldn't avoid making a mistake, but she quickly overcame them. School seemed to have gotten pretty interesting for her lately. Bill, who had been worried if she could do well in teaching the child, could now relax. But he was keenly aware of Leyla's pain and sadness that she was hiding in the depths of her heart. She was a child who could hardly throw away the worn bag because of her attachment to it. He knew what Kyle meant to her better than anybody else. It was hard for her to mend her wounds from losing Kyle. He was her closest friend, before he became an innocent lover so fast. She was much too frail to be able to heal herself. It's not time yet. After a long thought, Bill shoved Kyle's letter back into his pocket. Even after moving to Rats, Kyle sent a letter to Leyla once a week. Bill had explicitly asked to deliver the letter to only him. The postman had understood his intentions, and willingly complied with his request. Bill knew he was cruel, and his cowardice didn't represent an adult's attitude. But his need to protect Leyla trumped his regret and guilt over that boy. Uncle. Leyla waved at him, and Bill came to her. They sat next to each other on the porch and shared an apple while enjoying the cool weather as the forest was resplendent in the colors of autumn. Oh, I forgot. I have something to say to the butler. Uncle, would you please relay my message to him? Butler? Do you mean Mr. Hessen? Yes. Because of schoolwork. Leyla wiped the juice drop on her fingers with the handkerchief she took out from her apron. I'd like to ask the Duke if the children can have an autumn picnic in the Arvis forest. Ah, that's right, you must tell Hessen first, since you cannot directly approach the Duke. Sure. I'll ask instead of you. I'm a bit worried if it's a discourteous request. Discourteous? Don't worry, The Duke is notoriously generous with such things, and I'm sure he'll gladly allow it. Besides, Duke Herhardt is a sponsor of the school. Sponsor? Layla's eyes grew 3 sizes. Duke Herhardt is the sponsor of my school? A look of shock crossed her face. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Bill nodded. Did you not know that yet? Duke Herhardt funds virtually almost all schools in this district. I see. Layla muttered a little. She clamped her eyes shut, wanting to block off the Duke's face from her thoughts. Duke Herhardt's name followed her wherever she went in Karlsbar, and Layla was bound to accept that unavoidable reality. The King of Karlsbar. That was the moniker bestowed to Duke Herhardt by the citizens of this city. An imperial nobility on a par with the emperor's family in terms of wealth and power. He served both as a symbol and a source of pride for Karlsbar society. Why? Is there a problem with the Duke? Did his haughty fiancé bother you again? Layla shook her head, taken aback by Bill's question. No. How could that be? Once again, the Duke's face, his stare, and their suffocating moments sequentially seared into her memory, robbing her of her speech. Let's have a cup of tea, Uncle. Layla stood up and fled to the kitchen before Bill could answer. She poured the tea into the cup and placed the cake from Mrs. Mona on the serving plate after slicing it. The daytime was winding down, and the night was creeping into the house. But Layla hesitated to switch on the light as if she wanted to conceal her wariness in the dark. There was no need to rush. Matthias' opinion of Leyla Lewellin was as follows. He had a burning urge to have her, but he didn't want to jump the gun. Oh, Miss Lewellin is over there. Mark Evers giggled when he spotted Layla marching down the Platinus Road with her students. After Layla established herself as a decent grown-up and school teacher, Arvis residents started addressing her as Miss Lewellin. The driver chipped in. Today must be their picnic day. His grandmother granted the children from the local school to have an autumn picnic in Arvis Forest. His mother gave a cool nod to the idea as well. In essence, such consent came under the hostess's purview, which explained why Matthias raised no objections and respected their decision. The excited students surrounding her reminded Matthias of the first time Layla came to Arvis. She was still a child at heart who loved roaming the forest, who knew she could act so maturely in front of her students. A smile crept on Matthias' lips as he gazed from the car window. In the following moments, his car passed by Layla and the children. But her afterimage clung onto his thoughts for quite some time after that. These days, toying around with Leyla Lewellin had been his favorite pastime. The more severe he bullied her, the more vivid her reactions became. Her emotions didn't stray from embarrassment, anger, shame, and fear, but he savored every change in her emotions. Watching her flinch, get enraged, and speak back to him was much more entertaining than seeing her docile face with a polite smile. Last weekend, they'd bump into each other in the mansion's glass house. She was helping her uncle in tidying up the flower bed when she saw him. The color quickly drained from her face. Layla dropped her garden basket, and the soil-stained tubers were strewn over the paving stone. Bill Remmer, a few feet away, was busy tending to another flower bed and didn't seem to notice the fuss. He calmly approached and stood in front of her. When he stomped on the tubers with his shoes, Layla raised her head in a fit of fury. She looked nervous if anybody saw them, but her eyes were filled with an uncontrollable hatred. Matthias chuckled, remembering how the people regarded Leyla Lewellin as a kind and gentle lady who never spoke ill of anybody. However, it didn't stop him from being satisfied. As he had never learned to share his things with others, he was elated when Layla acted sharp-tempered just to him. The majestic birds living in the Arvis heavenly greenhouse made a loud chirp. Layla quickly scooped up the tubers as if she didn't want him to touch them, and then stood up. As she bowed and was about to run, he tripped over her leg. The basket in her hands toppled, and the tubers were scattered again on the paving stones. Layla stumbled, but he had already hugged her waist to save her from falling. Matthias recalled how frightened Layla was and how she quickly covered her mouth to prevent a scream. Even though the flowering season had withered away, he could still taste the faint scent of roses wafting from her skin. After letting her go, He took a step back and pointed to the falling tubers with his gaze. Leyla scowled, loathing visible in her eyes, but she had no option but to follow with his demand. Gnashing her teeth, she knelt to collect the tubers. When he kicked some tubers with the tip of his shoe towards her, a blush of heat bloomed on her cheeks. Its crimson color beautified her skin tone perfectly. Matthias wondered how beautiful it would be if he could paint her whole body with that hue. A lovely shade of red. The color of him. "What's my afternoon schedule?" Matthias queried when their car moved closer to the city center. "Today's last schedule is to attend the board of directors meeting." Matthias gave a satisfied nod and checked his wristwatch. He'd be able to return home earlier this afternoon. After getting out of the car, he took a moment to admire the cloudless high blue sky. The late afternoon sun bathed the buildings in its warm light and the wind kept everything crisp. The weather was perfect to enjoy autumn picnic. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 45. Princess Teacher. Is that person our teacher's father?" stuttered. The little boy blinked his eyes nervously. "Lies. He's not like our teacher at all." A little girl, smaller than the boy, whimpered, and other children who huddled behind Leyla reacted identically. Their eyes opened wide with fear as soon as Bill Remmer appeared in front of them. Bill was quite blasé at their not-so-extraordinary reaction. He disliked rowdy children, but Leyla had especially begged him to spare his time to guide the children who came for a picnic in the Arvis forest for a day. But he already felt that this wasn't an easy job. "Kids, Uncle Bill is a good person." Leyla smiled as she comforted her students. The timid little girl from a while ago again burst into tears after Bill showed his toothy grin. "Fuck. I don't do anything, Uncle." Leyla quickly hushed up Bill's violent cursing and knelt in front of the sobbing child. Unable to smile or frown, Bill could only stare at the tiny creatures with a quizzical face. "Uncle Bill is a very nice man and he will take us around the forest today." The sniveling child in her arms stopped weeping, and Leyla continued her praiseworthy explanation. "We're going to study flowers and trees in the forest with Uncle Bill. Won't it be fun?" The children seemed to disagree with their teacher's words, but they grudgingly nodded in tandem. "What a bunch of whiny." Bill scratched his head and began to lead the way. Leyla and the children were quick to follow his suit. "Come to think of it, I think you were around the same age as those children when I first met you." Bill's stiff lips softened when a flashback of memory flooded his thoughts. Uncle. These kids are all under the age of 10. Countered Leyla, with a frown on her face. "I was 11 years old at the time, about to become 12. Bill was joking when he said that, but Leyla took it seriously and she retorted by telling her age like the way she did the first time she came to Arvis. Bill chuckled, remembering that day. Leyla, his little girl who had always disliked being labeled small, now had grown up into a beautiful lady. It was a little past 1 o'clock when Matthias returned to the estate. The car made its way through the mansion and headed to the riverfront annex. The driver and his aide were baffled at first by his surprising order, but soon understood when they recalled that it was a picnic day for the rural school children. This kind of charity event was primarily the duty of the hostess, but there was no reason to exclude the Duke from participating. A gleam of bright sunlight bounced off the tree and caught the shrubs in its beams as the car drove through the forest to the riverside. The splendor of the forest colored with reds and oranges and the pristine river sparkling with luminous water scales became a natural fence that encircled both sides of the road. Arvis was a place that offered picturesque vistas all year round, but the period with the most splendid beauty by far was the autumn season. Matthias stared at the scenic view which passed like a movie scene with an odd feeling. Arvis, as he knew it, was either a verdant summer or a placid snowy winter. In the spring of his 12th year, he inherited the title of Duke after the death of his father. And the next summer, he enrolled at a school in the capital. From then on, he spent the spring and autumn in Rats and the summer and winter in Karlsbar, leading a life divided between the two cities. "Duke, it's been a while since you spent the autumn at Karlsbar, hasn't it?" The driver, who was watching Matthias as he gazed out the window, carefully asked. "Yes, that's true." Matthias nodded with an autumnal smile as he recalled his 11-year-old autumn memory. A very long time had passed, but his life seemed scarcely different between then and now. He was reared as the family's heir from his birth and was groomed to succeed his father as the Duke of Herhardt. It was a life mapped out in advance, only his turn had come sooner than planned. And the same circle would apply to Herhardt's future heir, whom he and Claudine would have. As was his life, which paralleled his father's. Matthias drew his gaze from the car window where the unfamiliar autumn landscape was unfolding. The car shortly came to a stop at the annex's pier. When the driver opened the back seat door, he was greeted by the children's laughter and chit-chat. After getting out of the car, Matthias looked in the direction of the sound. The little children he had seen this morning were merrily strolling along the riverbank. The gardener was following them, and Leyla. Her radiant smile resembled the fall sunshine. They met each other's eyes the moment she turned her head away from the children. She was dressed in a wide lace-collared top and a maple red skirt. Her teacher outfit looked great, but everything else about her was clunky. Matthias buttoned up his suit and walked into the autumn sun. "Oh. Is that Duke Herhardt?" Mrs. Grever asked, taken aback while staring at Matthias approaching them. She was the mother of two and the upper class's homeroom teacher. "Oh my God, this is my first time seeing him this close. He's even more handsome in person than the picture in the newspaper," she muttered in a lively tone, not giving Leyla a chance to answer. Mrs. Grever's jovial reaction made Leyla realize Duke Herhardt's notable reputation. The citizens admired and respected him, whose face was often featured in publications. But in her eyes, Matthias von Herhardt was nothing more than a psychopath. "By the way, Miss Lewellin." Mrs. Grever was about to speak when Matthias stood in front of them. "Hello, Duke." Bill, who was busy bickering with the children, hurriedly approached them and greeted him, which also made Mrs. Grever join in. Still soured by his jerk behavior last weekend, Leyla belatedly bowed her head. "Damn it. I should have thrown those tubers at him." She walked home from the greenhouse that day with terrible feelings. Even if she could rewind time, she wouldn't dare to commit such impudence. That's what she had to tell herself to quell her frustration. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. "Would you like to introduce this person to me, Miss Lewellin?" Matthias asked her nicely as Leyla had lifted her head. His gentlemanly, regal and courteous manners astounded her. He seemed to be a totally different person. Others' impressions of Duke Herhardt will always be like this. That insight amazed her. Leyla? The confused Bill patted her on the back. Ah. Yes, Duke." Leyla Pace came to her senses and took a perfect stance, clasping her hands beneath her navel. She decided not to lose her temper because she failed to throw the tubers at him. She set out to prove to the Duke that she had polished herself into a decent adult, no longer like a forest child he could just pester around at whim. Leyla introduced Mrs. Grever to him in a professional manner. She also patiently explained to the wondering children who Duke of Herhardt was. Leyla decided to go along with her children's adoration of him, even if she couldn't agree with most of what they said. If she had to tell the truth about what a terrible person he was, she would have to use offensive words that no child should ever hear. "Thank you so much for allowing us to have an autumn picnic, Duke." Leyla stood confidently before him, with her shoulders straightened and chin slightly up, proud of her performance. "Thanks to you, the children are having a great time." She also gave a soft emphasis on the term children to underline her position as a teacher. "Really?" Matthias' lips rose slightly as she spoke. "The one who is having a good time seems to be Miss Lewellin." "Pardon?" Matthias stayed quiet at her question. He did little more than snicker at her boggling expression and greeted Mrs. Grever and the kids goodbye with his gentlemanly persona that was able to mask his twisted personality. Matthias, his aide, and the driver then reversed and left the scene. Leyla stood silently watching their backs as they approached the riverfront annex. She did lose her understanding of his words until Mrs. Grever gave her the answer. Miss Lewellin." "Yes." "Your head." A little coy, Mrs. Grever pointed over her head. "Head? What's wrong with my head?" Leyla's bewildered face creased in a tick as she felt the soft touch of flowers and grass leaves on her head. Flower crown. There was a flower crown adorning her head. Monica, her youngest and closest student, had put the wildflower wreath she'd fashioned as Uncle Bill had taught her. Mrs. Grever felt awful for not telling her. "I was about to tell you, but Duke Herhardt suddenly came." Leyla was stone-faced. She was unable to speak and just blinked. "So I pretended to act like an adult while wearing this." A rush of shame overtook her. She almost yelled out the curse words Uncle Bill often used if it weren't for the children. "It's okay, teacher." Monica, the child who gave Leyla the flower crown, cheered her unlovingly. "You look pretty. Like a princess." The other children agreed with Monica and nodded their heads together. "Ha? Ha? Ha?" Leyla seemed to know too well why Uncle Bill was laughing so wildly. If one could die of shame, she was willing to fall deeply asleep on this beautiful autumn day. "There's nothing to be ashamed of." Bill delightedly patted her back. "It was just a little embarrassing, but it's not like you committed a crime or anything like that." At his words that weren't comforting at all, Layla's cheeks bloomed crimson as a ripened apple. Then, out of the blue, an even more shockingly bad ordeal befell her. Mr. Remmer, Miss Lewellin. Mark Evers, who had left with the Duke earlier, returned with a sprightly smile. "The Duke has invited the picnicking children to his annex. He wants to have tea with everyone. Of course, together with the 2 teachers and you two, Mr. Remmer." Wah! The frenzied child's cheering could be heard echoing through the forest. Mrs. Grever's jaw hung open, and Bill didn't seem to dislike the Duke's invitation. In everyone's thrills, Leyla looked blankly up into the sky, grabbing the flower that crowned her head. She knew shame couldn't kill a person, but she prayed at least it could knock her out. Leyla earnestly begged, yet her mind was as clear as the dazzling blue of an autumn sky.